4 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning to you. Here's an interesting little thing that we will get onto at some point in the not too distant future. A Dutch political philosopher is asking a question that we've asked on this programme a few times. How much is too much? She's invented something called Humanitarianism. The idea that there should be a cap upon just how much wealth the wealthiest people can have. They'd still be the wealthiest people, of course. I'm just seeding that with you. That's homework. I want you to start thinking about that. I don't think we'll get onto it this week. Maybe not even next week, but soon and for the rest of your life. No, I want you to think about that. Humanitarianism. How much is too much? There are questions coming up, I think, for society as a whole that are philosophical rather than sort of sociological or economic. I think there is a great reckoning on the horizon when it comes to things like inequality and global warming and the settlement, if you like, the social contract. But I won't concern you with such matters today. I look at rather more urgent matters today. I look at this strange insistence that the escalating situation in Yemen, where American and British forces continue to attack positions held by so-called Houthi rebels, who themselves are launching attacks on, they say, American and British ships that, or affiliated vessels whose sponsor countries are supporting Israel's continuing offensive in Gaza. And speaking of Israel's continuing offensive in Gaza, I don't know whether this is going to be relevant to the answers you provide to the question that I'm about to ask, but there is quite a lot of coverage, very poignant coverage in the British newspapers today of the 21 soldiers who were killed while carrying out a demolition operation in Gaza. That they were working to destroy 2 houses in a buffer zone along the inside of the border with Israel when Hamas militants fired a rocket-propelled grenade at them, and the explosive charges they were laying to blow up these houses instead killed the soldiers. They were in the houses and they were still killed. And the headline in the Times I thought was very interesting. It says, Israel mourns bloodiest day in Gaza. I just thought that was telling in so many ways. So the bloodiest day in Gaza saw 21 Israeli soldiers tragically killed by their own explosives. And yet the death toll for Palestinians, as we have mentioned a few times in the last few days, has now exceeded 25,000. These deaths receive considerably more coverage in almost all of the UK media than any of those 25,000. I'm not entirely sure why that is, and I'm conscious that even opening the door to answering that question could lead in some pretty poisonous and unpleasant positions, but I will leave it hanging. 21 soldiers tragically killed yesterday while preparing to blow up somebody's homes in Gaza, receiving way more coverage in almost all of the British media than any of the 25,000 Palestinian deaths so far. That's not an opinion, that's just counting. And that brings us to Keir Starmer, who I have been feeling rather warm towards of late. I don't know whether you've noticed. I feel that he has really played a blinder on the so-called culture wars, so much so that the Daily Mail today appears to have had some sort of crisis. Having spent years banging on about the culture wars and wokeness, today the Daily Mail warns us that the woke are responsible for the fact that we don't make advertisements anymore like the ones we used to make 50 years ago. So, I mean, why can't we have advertisements like a good old-fashioned Benson and Hedges advert, asks the writer across 2 pages in the Daily Mail today, before telling us that the answer is all the wokes, all the wokeness. So having given a speech in which he essentially said, oh, stop being so silly and grow up with all the woke stuff, will you? Particularly with regard to the National Trust and the RNLI. The people who've spent the last 2 years banging on endlessly about wokeness, the people, in fact, who inspired Woke Watch, which I will probably do today, although I've already told you what's going to be in it, inspired Woke Watch, the feature on this programme, And now, because Keir Starmer has given a speech in which he said, "Oh, do grow up, you silly little people," they're absolutely furious with him for engaging in the culture wars. The columnist Sarah Vine has written, a characteristically incoherent piece about how Keir Starmer is a disgrace because he's got involved in the culture wars. You'll remember that Rishi Sunak appointed a politician called Esther McVeigh and let it be known that she was the minister for being anti-woke. But Keir Starmer giving a speech telling everyone to grow up is an appalling intervention in the so-called culture wars because, well, I don't know why. So that will probably feature in Smear Keir today. So thank God for the Daily Mail. Without the Daily Mail, we would probably not have a Woke Watch or a Smear Keir. Most days, let alone today. But Keir Starmer, I think, let us down a bit yesterday. Possibly even a lot, because he shared the position that we were examining from Rishi Sunak's point of view. This continuing insistence that attacking Houthi positions in Yemen has absolutely nothing to do with the situation in Gaza, even as the Houthis make it clear that the reason why they are attacking certain vessels in that strait, in that Red Sea, is precisely because they are vessels affiliated with or flying under the flags of countries that are supporting Israel's offensive in Gaza. So I'll play you Sunak's words first, and then I'm going to play you Starmer's words, which I think are probably worse in many ways than Sunak's. And then I think I'm going to nudge you towards the question of why they, I don't normally like using the vague they in the questions that I ask you. But when you've got the two leaders of the two major parties singing from an almost identical hymn sheet, then I think you can use the word they in a sort of populist way. Why are they so desperate? Why are they so desperate to insist that these attacks have got nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza? 0345 6060 973 will be the number that you need. So first, let's hear from Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat that there is no link between our actions of self-defence in the Red Sea and the situation in Israel and Gaza. Those who make that link do the Houthis work for them. And I want to be clear that those here at home who glorify the Houthis' attacks are glorifying terrorism, plain and simple. They will be met with a zero-tolerance approach.
I haven't come across anyone glorifying the Houthis' attacks. And as we've said from the start, if you shoot things at me, then we will shoot things back at you. And that seems to me to be a fairly reasonable rationale upon which to conduct military operations. And therefore, the attacks upon Houthi positions are, for my money, completely justified, unless there are repercussions and ramifications that I'm currently missing, in which case you know what to do. But and the last thing I want to do is do the Houthis' work for them. God forbid that we should end up doing the Houthis' work for them. But I mean, how can it be that attacking ships because of affiliate or because of support for the situation in Gaza prompts attacks on the people attacking the ships because of the situation in Gaza, but it all has absolutely nothing to do with the situation in Gaza? It's strange, but. And if you were listening yesterday, you'll know I've got this problem sometimes of thinking, well, it can't be as I see it because they're in charge. It's the closest I come to deference. You can't end up even now, after Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, there is a part of me that says you can't end up being Prime Minister if you're a complete wombat. You can't end up being Prime Minister if you're just not very bright or not very good at politics. It's a bit like in the case of Johnson, you can't end up being Prime Minister if you're a pathological liar, sexually incontinent, and morally corrupt. But you can, because there he is. He's been Prime Minister, and he is a pathological liar, sexually incontinent, and morally corrupt. I've still got this weird... What is it? What is it? What is wrong with me? I've watched Liz Truss spend 10 minutes in Downing Street, set fire to the British economy, and I still have something inside me that says you can't be Prime Minister if you're completely stupid. It's bizarre, isn't it? You look, I don't think I've got it in America. I don't know whether it's because Trump is just 10 times worse than everybody ever. You look at America and think, no, you really can have an absolute catastrophe, an absolute liability. You really can have a fascist, a full-on fascist in the White House. The American Constitution is not designed to withhold that threat, to withstand that threat. But I've still got it for Blighty. Is it patriotism? Is it a form of weird power? I refuse to believe that you can rise to the highest offices in this land if you are a wombat. And here we are, Rishi the Wombat, currently Prime Minister. So yesterday I was tying myself in knots trying to come up with ways of justifying his words that in a way that didn't take us all for mugs. And today I've got to do the same for Keir Starmer.
Like the Prime Minister, I totally reject the Houthi claims that attacking ships from around the world is somehow linked to the conflict in Gaza. These attacks do absolutely nothing for the Palestinian people.
So, why? I mean, one of the answers to the question that I'm about to ask you could simply be because it's true, James, but you need a little bit of help understanding precisely what is going on. Okay, so why are Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer so adamant that attacking Houthi positions in Yemen has nothing to do with what's going on in Israel and Gaza, when under, pretty much any reading of the situation, they have at least something to do with what's going on in Gaza, and arguably everything to do with what is going on in Gaza. So don't go mad on me, all right? Don't come in with conspiracy theories. I certainly won't tolerate any anti-Semitic sort of tales of domination or influence. I want to know why Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are so adamant that the attacks upon Houthi positions in Yemen have nothing to do with what is going on in Gaza, when any observer must suspect that there is some link, even if it's tiny. This insistence that there's no link whatsoever. What is that all about? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. And the numbers are, altogether now, 0345 6060 973. It is 10:18. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you're wondering why we haven't gone in this morning on the new Tory leadership battle, well, the reasons are twofold. Number one, you might not have heard of it. And number two, they like bloody buses, honestly. They come around so regularly now. I know the bus analogy doesn't actually speak to regularity. It speaks to a very, very long wait and then two come along at once. But they're just, it's just boring. Someone called Simon Clarke, I don't know. I think Liz Truss thought he was worthy of a senior position in government. At which point, most people, I think, with brains would resign. It's like the black spot, is it, in Treasure Island? Liz Truss thinks that you're worthy of a position in cabinet. Right, that's it for me. I'm afraid I'm leaving politics now. Liz Truss would like to make you Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I resign. I resign immediately. What the hell have I done to catch Liz Truss's eye? How on earth has the pork markets lady ended up thinking that I might be a valid... But anyway, someone called Simon Clarke has called for Rishi Sunak to resign or something. So we're not doing it in the first hour. In the second hour, we might do it, but it will be under the banner of asking what the fudge is wrong with the Tory party. Now, though, we're looking at the situation in Yemen, and we're wondering why Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are both so adamant that it has nothing to do with what is going on in Gaza. A position that I don't understand, that's all. And I don't much like. The second position is probably negotiable. The first position is obviously up for grabs. Simon's in Torbay. Simon, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I've listened for a long time. I've never spoken to you before, so, thanks.
It's funny what tempts people out of Purdah, isn't it? Out of self-imposed. But it's not a great phone line, Simon, so it may not even be a very long conversation, but I shall disrupt you no further.
I'll do my best. Of course, I've been listening to this particular story with great interest because there's a historical context. To go back a couple of hundred years, Britain and also the USA, but let's focus just on Britain, made an awful lot of its wealth that turned into an empire from, in fact, sinking and interrupting and stealing from enemy ships and essentially piracy, although we didn't call it piracy, we called it privateering.
Privateering. How dare you suggest that Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh were not... You're very woke, aren't you? You want to rewrite history. This is outrageous. They were not privateers. They were early pioneers of wealth redistribution, Simon.
They were, and of course it wasn't political because it was for Britain. And the song... Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. That doesn't come from nowhere. That has a context.
Yes.
And Lloyd's of London is in London, and the International Maritime Association is in London. And Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, I think basically when both the leaders of the two main parties agree on something, we're beyond politics.
Yes.
That is now the British establishment speaking.
Gosh.
We will not put up with this. because we rule the waves. Britannia rules the waves, and we'll just forget how we made our fabulous wealth in the first place.
So there's a subconscious jingoistic belief that we still rule the waves, albeit that we're here very much as Robin to America's Batman. That would explain the British involvement in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, America, the USA rules the waves as well. It was just Britain. We sort of passed that mantle on to the USA to a large degree.
No, I get all of that, and I nudge you now towards the question. That's helpful context and actually a timely reminder. Yeah. And indeed, I mean, I know that you know this, but I need to remind myself sometimes. It explains the disaster, the foreign policy disaster of Suez. Actually, precisely the mindset that you've just described explains the foreign policy disaster of Suez. So why are Sunak and Starmer both so adamant that it's got nothing to do with Gaza when most people, whatever their position, suspect that it probably has something to do with Gaza?
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, because they have no choice. They have to. It's the only position which is consistent with British history, for one thing, and consistent with the current situation in Israel. We've put ourselves very strongly in support of Israel. For reasons. But we and Israel have made it a big thing that Hamas is an Islamist terrorist organisation. Now, The Houthis are also an Islamist terrorist organisation.
Yes.
And so we, as allies of Israel, therefore have and America, have no choice but to come out against these other. And our pretext, of course, is the economy. Of course, that's the pretext, because there is no other.
That doesn't explain why they insist it's got nothing to do with Gaza. That explains... you're allowed to say I don't know, because I'm not sure I do.
I just think they have to. I think they have to box these things off.
It could be true. It could be true that it's got nothing to do with Gaza, but it's an odd flex when the Houthis are saying it's got everything to do with Gaza, and the evidence does rather support them on this.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, do we believe the people that are doing the thing, or do we believe other people who have a vested interest in the thing? I mean,
Well, neither, necessarily. I don't want to believe the Houthis over my own government, ever, to be honest with you, because, as you say, they're Islamist terrorists. They tick all the boxes. Child soldiers, executing civilians. They're a disgusting bunch of people. But that doesn't mean they're lying when they say this is why we're doing this thing.
Well, but as you have, remarked many times on your own show, the people who constitute our government, they're not on our side. Our best interests are not of interest to them, and so if they're not on our side, let's call it a trust deficit. There's a trust deficit.
There is a trust deficit, and it's growing for me because, as you've just highlighted, it's possible that this particular incident puts Sunak and Starmer in the same establishment-shaped category, which is quite worrying in many ways. Cameron, thank you, Simon. A sparkling debut. I look forward to your second contribution to the programme. David Cameron is on his way to the Middle East, and it is reported that his visit will put pressure on Israel. Netanyahu's under pressure from all sides now. One of the great failures of Western media coverage throughout this crisis has been how self-interested Netanyahu's motivation was and how comfortable he was with the failure to secure the hostages. The failure to secure the hostages means he can carry on blowing up the Gaza Strip, and that arguably is a much bigger priority for him than rescuing any hostages. That certainly is the view of many of the hostages' families. But there was a line that I thought was remarkable in some of the analysis today, which effectively said, everyone agrees, the Foreign Secretary will tell the Israeli Prime Minister the war cannot continue for a moment longer than necessary. And we're back to where we started, aren't we, on the question of proportionality. How much is too much? When does it cease to be necessary or unnecessary? Crazy business, really. Everyone knows it's going to have to end. Nobody knows when it is or what it will look like when it does. But that's not what we're doing today. What we're doing today is wondering why both of them, the two party leaders, are adamant that it's got nothing to do with Gaza. When, I mean, look, I'm not stupid, and I think it almost certainly does. Chetan is in Slough. Chetan, what would you like to say?
Hello, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I think there's two reasons. I think there's the moral element to this, and then there's the political element.
Yes.
If the government was to, if they were to accept the relationship between the Houthi strikes on international lanes and Gaza, it would have to reopen the whole debate on why on earth are we providing diplomatic cover to Israel, especially given the continuing destruction in Gaza, given the death toll in Gaza and given that Israel has rejected a two-state solution.
And given the international
Yes.
part, I mean, once you move outside of the US and the UK and some sort of relatively piddling allies, the world is almost united in opposition to what's going on there.
Absolutely. And I think that debate, the counterattacks that it will open the government up to, is very embarrassing, because how can the government stand there and justify it? They can't really. And that's why if they were to accept that relationship and entertain that debate, Rishi Sunak and indeed Keir Starmer will find it very difficult to justify their past comments and actions. And I think...
Why would they? Sorry, you lost me there. It's my fault, I'm sure. Why would they find it difficult to justify their past actions and comments?
In relation to, if they were to say, okay, the Houthis and what they're doing in Gaza, if there's a link there, if the natural question is then, why on earth are we continuing to sort of back what is going on in Gaza in relation to the wider sort of regional instability that it's causing? The government may find it very difficult, I think, in order to explain how it's going to bring an end to what is going on here, and how it's going to bring an end to not only what's going on in the Red Sea, but also what's going on in Gaza. I think the government will find it very difficult, in my opinion.
I understand what you're saying, almost by a process of intellectual osmosis. I'm kind of absorbing your thoughts, but neither of us have got them completely nailed down in terms of words, have we? It feels that it would be very difficult to sustain those two positions simultaneously, but I don't think we've pinned down precisely why.
Yeah, sorry.
Mate, I do 20-minute monologues and don't pin down anything. It's not a criticism. I'm welcome aboard. I'm just saying, yes, it feels obvious. They can't admit that it's linked to Gaza. They have to pretend that it isn't, because otherwise the situation in Gaza would assume a new complexion that would be profoundly uncomfortable for them as they continue to resist or they continue to fail to call for a ceasefire. That's the point, isn't it? That something there feels unsustainable, but we haven't quite pinned down what or why. I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I do agree with that. I think as well, the other element is that obviously Rishi Sunak is not in the best position at home, obviously with calls to resign from his ex-ministers, obviously with his inability to fulfill his 5 pledges. I think if you were to compound upon him what is reopening that debate on Gaza on top of what's going on already at home, I think Rishi Sunak will find it, along with everything else, to be a very difficult situation for him to manage alongside everything else that is going on in his own party and domestically. And I think that's a very dangerous combination for him. Because to put another wrinkle in the conversation, Kemi Badenoch slagging off Joe Biden left, right, and centre at the moment, and trying to blame him for the failures of Brexit. Although she doesn't call them failures of Brexit, of course, she's trying to blame Joe Biden for the absence of any trade deal that Barack Obama warned would happen in the event of Brexit. So why he needs to be cozying up to Joe Biden is perhaps another question for another day. But why he needs to state and insist but it's got nothing to do with Gaza, is, it's getting closer. It's as if I'll tell you what Chetan and Simon have done. It's as if they've turned the focus knob a bit, haven't they? They've turned the focus knob a bit, but it's still a bit blurry. Speaking of knobs, Lee Anderson has given an interview to the Daily Telegraph today in which he's asking for his old job back. I've just seen this. I shall give you more details after the very latest news headlines with Thomas Watts. 10:34 is the time. I'm going to read you 2 texts that are completely at odds with each other, and I shall read them without comment because I think it's a sign that the conversation is both worth having and complicated, not to mention very interesting. Question from Lisa. Why do you think the Houthis have recommenced attacking ships? Is it because they want to impose the, quotes, valid, end quotes, sanctions on Israel in order to save Gazans, or is it because Iran has told them to do so? I would say that Starmer and Sunak believe the latter, and I'm not sure I disagree. You appear to be buying the very clever PSYOPs operation currently being forged by Iran. ! Incidentally, I think Starmer is showing himself to be the man of metal we need for PM.
And by complete contrast, Josh has listened to the same half an hour of radio and has texted they have to peddle this lie because the Houthis are saying that they're acting under international law, which states that there's a legal requirement to prevent genocide. I haven't seen that, Josh, but I'll take your word for it. This is why they have to peddle this rubbish, because then the question becomes, why is Britain, a signatory to the Geneva Convention, not doing anything other than be complicit in the genocide? We've had a conversation already this week about whether or not that word is appropriate. It has been used by the chief rabbi in dismissing its use in the context of what's going on in Gaza. And, of course, it's been used by the South African government in the context of a case currently being heard by the International Court of Justice. So it is certainly not the case, Josh, that word can be inserted into the conversation unchallenged. But there are two positions, both relatively pertinent and informed, and yet completely at odds with each other. We must be talking about the Middle East. Claire's in York. Claire, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
I mean, this absolutely pains me to say this.
Go on. I'm sorry to hear that.
But for the first time in my life and the last time in my life, I agree with Sunak.
Go on.
I can't. I can almost. I'm choking on those words, but I agree. Well, it's easier to say I agree with Keir Starmer.
Yes, fair enough.
I think what's happening in Gaza is a disgusting stain on humanity, but I don't think for 1 minute the Houthis care about what's happening in Gaza. Their hate for Israel, the West and the USA is of far more importance. They terrorise their own people. And I heard
They do. Categorically they do. If anyone's not clear about this, the whole gamut of child soldiers right through to public execution.
It would be like the Taliban saying that they were concerned about women's rights in Iran, for them to think that the Houthis are caring about what's going on in Gaza. I heard a female Yemeni activist being interviewed on Newsnight and she said she was so concerned about how the Houthis are using this as propaganda and the West are falling for it, and how this was just giving them more legitimacy.
Well, it has done that. It's also increased their popularity at home, but I suppose...
yes, and she was really worried about this. She was really concerned.
Because that's bad news for Yemen.
Yes, it is. Of course, it is. And the Houthis are just. I just think that they're lying in clover with this. Because the whole West is up in arms, support and thinking that the Houthis are these moral saviours, and it's just absolute nonsense.
Brilliantly put.
Why would we believe what the Houthis say? After years of terrorising their own people, raping their women, why would they care about what's happening in Gaza when they're doing that to their own fellow...
Well, I have two thoughts. The first is that the timing that does somewhat undermine your reasoning.
No, I think...
Hang on, you can come straight back at me. And the second is, I think you're almost certainly right about the likelihood of them suddenly having discovered reservoirs of empathy for the ordinary Gazan, the ordinary Palestinian in Gaza. But it could be solidarity with the other death cult in the region, couldn't it? It could be a form of solidarity with Hamas, which means that it is wrong again, but for different reasons. Hang on, it's wrong for different reasons for Sunak and Starmer to say that it's got nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza.
Well, I think clearly that what they're saying is the plight of Gazans. I think we've got to differentiate Gaza with Hamas. The Houthis might be doing it in support of Hamas, but they're not doing it in support of Gazans.
No, but that gives the lie to the claim that it's got nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza. Well,
I think that they're profiteering from that.
Yes, and it's sort of cultural and almost PR profiteering.
Yes, I think they've been building this up for a while, and now this is just the icing on the cake for them to really get going the support.
So what about the timing, though, Claire? How come it coincides with the conflict in Gaza so completely?
From what I've heard is that there's clear evidence that they had been building this up with Iran, and that there had been movements and that had been witnessed through intelligence, that they had been building up to these attacks on
So you
on
said,
the Red Sea.
the argument would be that they would have happened regardless.
I think it's fortuitous. I think it's just
From
a
their point of view.
fortuitous,
Okay.
conflict. What's the word? Conflagration.
Congregation?
It came together at the right time.
Yes.
It's just
Yes.
the stars aligned for them, I think.
I think, that's one of the best explanations I've heard, and I would quite like to have heard it, and I hope you'll take this as a compliment, Claire, although I'm not entirely sure you will. I would have quite liked to have heard that in the House of Commons yesterday.
Okay. I'll take it.
That'll do. And there it is, the first and only time that Claire will find herself offering full-throated support for the position adopted by Rishi Sunak. And there you go. I can feel my pendulum swinging, not to make light of the issue. Still, some 250 people dying every day in the Gaza Strip. And as it is very, very widely reported in all of the British newspapers today, 24 Israeli soldiers died yesterday. As well. 10:41 is the time. Harriet is in Kingston. Harriet, what do you think? What would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
I wonder if it's because they are trying to dial down not the rhetoric, but to dissuade any other rogue factions chipping in, because they're like, okay, cool, well, they're doing it, so we can say we're doing it. And personally, I wonder if it's to sort of, it sounds extreme, but stop a world war from happening, because I truly believe that most of us sitting in our chairs at night watching the news are thinking, this is a world war, this is going to be in a world war. Really? And I wonder, yeah, I do. I mean, I do. My husband does, friends I speak to do, because it's because what's happening with the Houthis. I think that it gives an invitation to spurious people, little armies, thinking, right, we can chip in and we can say it's in the name of backing the Palestinians, because what Israel is doing is so
It becomes
awful.
a proxy war.
Yeah, and that's my fear. Yeah, that's
so they have to keep insisting that it's got nothing to do with what's going on there, even though under any analysis, including Claire's rather brilliant analysis just before you, it would still have something to do with Gaza, if not what many of us thought it had to do with Gaza in the first place.
Yeah, because I feel that they have to say, you can try and say it, but we know it's not. We know it's not. We're and also the other thing is, and I'm not a military expert by any means, but
don't worry, nor's Grant Shapps, and he's Secretary of State for Defence, Harriet.
Well, I wonder if it's because then we all have to play by the rules of war.
Yes.
And at the moment, we're going in quite heavy-handedly, aren't we? Because also, and also the other thing is, we all know that this is going to add to our overall cost of living.
Yes.
And then they have to play by the rules, and if the other teams are not playing by the rules, then again, to me, that means there's going to be an all-out war, and that's my fear.
So you are cautiously supportive of Sunak and Starmer's position, then?
No,
well, for pragmatic reasons, if not principled ones.
For pragmatic, I mean, I just, I can't. Oh God, I feel that. Well, I just feel that Sunak's this little man that's in charge of really big toys now, and he's just saying stuff to make himself look big and powerful. And I want to believe that Keir Starmer is doing it for really, really.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
like a touch of the head boy syndromes, perhaps from Sunak. I think I'm going to do this. I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to scare you even more. Given the have you seen the front page of the Telegraph today?
No, thank goodness.
Are you sitting down?
Yeah.
Army Chief. Public face call-up if UK goes to war.
Oh, no, I did see that. I saw that on Apple News last night before I went.
It didn't exactly calm your fears, did it?
No, but it's a reality. We don't have enough. Well, from what I've read, we don't have enough people, and also for ground attacks, we don't have enough people. So people will be called up, just like they are being called in Israel. I know that they've all got compulsory kinds of
and they've all got military experience behind them.
What's happened in Ukraine, and I also reckon that this is something to do with Putin. I think it's all so connected. I feel that Hamas decided to do what they did, on October the 7th, because Putin is just getting away with it. How can we let him get away with this all the time? So, the Ukrainians were drafted in, the Russians have been drafted in, and to me, it just all feeds into it. This is going to be an almighty fight.
Which is why the two front pages that contain the word escalation and the third front page that warns of conscription are perhaps not to be ignored, despite the temptation to do so. Harriet, beautifully put. Thank you so much. Those last two calls in particular, turning that focus knob the picture is getting ever sharper, isn't it? And it is, and got to be honest about this stuff. There's no point having these phone-ins if you're not. It is increasingly taking the heat off Sunak and Starmer, who I certainly began this hour thinking were behaving at the very best, in a profoundly questionable way. 10:49 is the time. Jane says, a brilliant current and last caller. They put into words what I could never manage. Some on the far left think the UK has more power than we do. Maybe. I think some on the right are pretty deluded about how much power we have in the modern world as well, Jane. World War III currently feels more possible than at any time since 1984. And I'm going to play you the clips again, actually, of Sunak and Starmer, because I think I am moving towards a much better understanding of why they said what they said, and indeed perhaps an appreciation of why they said it. We'll start with Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat that there is no link between our actions of self-defense in the Red Sea and the situation in Israel and Gaza. Those who make that link do the Houthis work for them. And I want to be clear that those here at home who glorify the Houthis' attacks are glorifying terrorism, plain and simple. They will be met with a zero-tolerance approach.
And now Keir Starmer, who I think goes further.
Like the Prime Minister, I totally reject the Houthi claims that attacking ships from around the world is somehow linked to the conflict in Gaza. These attacks do absolutely nothing for the Palestinian people.
And that is why, if you factor in something called the Combined Maritime Forces as well, a sort of multinational maritime partnership which exists to uphold the rules-based international order. I know what you're thinking. Oh, the Tories suddenly care about rules-based international order. But it is there to counter illicit non-state actors on the high seas. And the UK and the USA, given their naval capabilities, are obviously going to be at the forefront of any engagement by the Combined Maritime Forces, albeit that it involves there's 40 nations involved in that multinational naval partnership. So it's not cognitive dissonance, is it? It's more sustaining two, or maybe it is cognitive dissonance, sustaining two kind of conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. But it's very hard to argue. It's very hard to believe that it absolutely has nothing whatsoever to do with the situation in Gaza. But the reasons for the American and British responses to the Houthis do not have anything to do with the situation in Gaza. Now, in order to sustain that, they have to say, in a sense, that the Houthis are lying about why they're doing what they're doing, and they might be. But you can, I think, separate the two. I can answer one question from Simon, expressing some scepticism about why the Houthis would have these kind of weapons in the first place, given that they're conducting a civil war within Yemen. The answer is that they inherited an incredible stockpile of weapons, mate, from a previous Yemeni president. And those weapons had come in from all over the shop. They'd come in from North Korea. They'd come in from Russia. They'd even been bought from previous regimes in Ukraine. So they've just, and Iranian weapons as well, of course, which they continue to receive. But they inherited huge arms caches from all of those states. So there you go. Finally, I sound a bit knowledgeable. I read that this morning. 10:52 is the time. Naz is in Cardiff. Naz, what would you like to say?
It's the first time, James, that I totally disagree with you. I agree with you on almost everything.
Well, that's very healthy. But what are you? Because I'm not entirely sure what my opinion is, so I can't wait to hear what you disagree with.
Well, what I disagree with the ladies saying is, I abhor terrorism. I don't support the Houthis.
Of course.
But the timing. Why didn't they do it before, all these years before? And then for Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, as usual, taking the other side. As usual, supporting Israel, defending Israel. What are they doing for the Palestinians in Gaza? Nothing. They've got armies to go and shoot the Houthis, but Israel is continuing every day to kill children, every day. And for the Muslims, for me as a Muslim, British-born Muslim in this country, born here, it makes me cry. I cannot believe what is happening. They're such hypocrites. Starmer and Sunak. Look, for Ukraine, everybody went out full for Ukraine. What are they doing? Is it that Palestinian children are not worth their lives are not worth anything? How dare people do that? I've been a Labour supporter all my life, and I am 61. I have never, ever seen, and I've studied history.
Yes.
Never again, they said. Never again. But you're all standing there and still saying Israel has to have the right to defend itself. Yes, it does have the right. Of course, Hamas shouldn't have done October the 7th.
But the fear, which has been in place from late October, probably the fear that banner of defending itself would extend to epic destruction and carnage in Gaza has now been realised, and there's no sign, certainly not from Netanyahu's end of the conversation, there's no sign of it diminishing or ending anytime soon. I hear you, and I feel you as well, actually, Naz, and I'm so sorry for what you're going through emotionally.
Mentally, honestly,
mentally, I know. But I, in the context of the conversation that we're having today, are we sure that they are inextricably linked? I'm on a crash course at the moment regarding the combined maritime forces. It is possible, I think, to separate America and the UK protecting international trade routes from illegal non-state actors, regardless of why the illegal non-state actors are doing what they're doing. And that they've engaged in piracy before, they've engaged in drone attacks before, and they have been stockpiling their capability for doing so long before the October the 7th terror attack. So if I don't challenge anything that you've said about the American and UK response, not the world's response to what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza, I don't think it necessarily means that there is a direct link between that and what is happening now in Yemen. Not direct.
No. Maybe. I can shift a bit on that. But the fact that the world is still watching, James. The fact that the world is still watching, and there's argument and the vetoes, and can people understand? I know personally of someone that has seen his sister raped, Palestinian, has seen his sister raped, his mother killed, his father killed. What are we? What aren't we human beings? What are we?
And yes, I can't answer that question. I can't answer that question, except with a repeat of the one I asked you a moment ago, which was about the.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you have, and you're more than welcome to do so to bring your pain to the programme. But it's not necessarily pain that's pertinent to the. And I don't mean this as a criticism, but it's not necessarily pain that is pertinent to the conversation we've been having this morning.
No, I do understand that, and I do say, all right, we can defend our waters and things like that, but I just want people to realise, completely, that there's a grey area. There has to be a grey area again.
Yes.
And it's always Britain and the USA. Yes. I wonder why France doesn't get involved. Why doesn't Germany get involved?
They don't have the capability, is one answer. But they also are not offering full-throated support. Australia is, oddly, but there are... There is certainly room for more enthusiastic support from other countries than has currently been secured, but it's not an entirely... I mean, certainly the combined maritime forces are a 40-strong coalition of international naval powers, among whom the Americans will be by far the most powerful. But yeah, I'm glad you rang in today, even if it wasn't bang on topic, Naz, because I don't understand why the pain you feel is reflected almost nowhere in the British media, and yet the pain many people will feel about the deaths yesterday of 24 Israeli soldiers is reflected almost everywhere. It feels a little unfair.
Yeah.
That imbalance.
And I don't want any deaths Please get me right. I don't want any death anywhere. That's my opinion. I don't want any from both sides to die in Israel and Palestine. I don't want any death, but I'm just saying, thank you for reflecting that in the media as well, we just feel totally alone.
I understand.
As a community,
that's not an opinion, is it? That's just counting. Not necessarily counting casualties and deaths, which seems like a grim currency, but counting pages, counting paragraphs, counting coverage. Naz, thank you. Amazing calls that hour. I hope that's not a glib thing to say, but informative one moment and profoundly moving the next, and of course deeply troubling. This isn't going away, this story. I can tell you that for nothing. Nor, perhaps, is the next conversation we're going to have, which is a variation upon a theme that's becoming something of a hardy perennial on this programme. Would you believe that a former minister, albeit a relatively nondescript and irrelevant one, has launched an attack upon Rishi Sunak's leadership, calling for him to resign and be replaced? So, once again, we find ourselves asking, what the fudge has happened to the Tory party? 3 minutes after 11 is the time. An old pal of my dad's has been in touch. It's very much a Francophile. Brilliant journalist. It was on the Telegraph with my old man back in the day, Colin Randall. Has written a rather excellent blog post having a polite swing at me for supporting Keir Starmer's current stance on Brexit. It just arrived this morning, that's why I mention it. But it's very much a holding position, the idea that Starmer's not going to go near it, despite growing public dissatisfaction and despite the fact, and I'm sorry if this upsets you, but despite the fact that only an absolute numpty could still be clinging to the notion that it was a good idea in the first place. Just because I'm a nice bloke, I'll let you have, it could have gone well, but it hasn't. I'll let you have that. But the idea that it is going well, I'm afraid, is absolute numpty stroke Kemi Badenoch territory. And I don't believe she believes it. She just thinks it is the best way of securing passage to the top of the Tory party. But I can feel it growing as an issue. I think we are going to be talking about it a little bit more, particularly come the end of January when the new customs requirements kick in, when there will be loads more red tape, loads more friction at our borders, and even the viability of pretending that your vote for less friction and less red tape has been honoured will become unsustainable. Jacob Rees-Mogg reduced now to shouting at stately homes and offering up full-throated support for foreign sex offenders in the case of Donald Trump. It's kind of where he should always have been, on the absolute fringes of British politics as a sort of tolerated eccentric, reduced today, as I say, to shouting at stately homes and cheerleading for a sex offender. Quite extraordinary, really, that he casts himself both as a moralist and indeed as a constitutionalist when he has complete contempt for both morals and constitutions, as he demonstrated. So I mentioned him only as a prominent Brexiter. I'm going to play you a little clip of another prominent Brexiter at the moment before we turn our attention to the latest Tory leadership row or bid even. An MP called Simon Clarke, whose talents are such that only Liz Truss really recognised them, has called for Rishi Sunak to resign. And it has emerged that he's received a £40,000 donation from, wait for it, JCB, who the owner of which, a chap called Bamford, was of course a key supporter of Brexit, pretty much apart from the Wetherspoons bloke. Can I take a moment to say something about him, or is that too much of a digression? Listen, he should never have got the attention that he got during the Brexit referendum because he didn't really know what he was talking about. But he runs brilliant pubs. I don't like the snobbery that surrounds Wetherspoons. If you like beer, especially if you're and you get good value food in there, I found myself in a couple of Wetherspoons latterly. And despite having a sort of childish intent never to go in one because of the owner's support for Brexit, I don't like the snobbery that goes with the conversations about Tim Martin. You can make like mildly affectionate gags about the fact that he looks like a Thundercat, because it's true, but I don't like the snobbery that goes with it. He, however, was not a massive business voice. The four business voices that were constantly wheeled out in support of Brexit against pretty much the entirety of the business establishment were the Wetherspoons fella, the JCB fella, the Dyson fella, and Digby Pudding Jones, who has completely disappeared from public life, which you almost have to give him credit for. because other complete puddings, like David Pudding Frost, have continued to rise. In fact, there's a ludicrous poll in the Telegraph today, and when you ask the people who conducted the poll who paid for it, they reply that we've been told to direct all media inquiries to David Pudding Frost. Quite incredible. So many puddings, so little sweet. But the JCB bloke has given 40 grand to the bloke that's now launched a leadership bid against Rishi Sunak. So the so-called Brexiters are still on manoeuvres, which is extraordinary, and a timely moment perhaps to remind ourselves about what one of their key players had to say in the run-up to or shortly after the referendum. And then I'm going to ask you this question. What has happened to the Tory party? I may go into a little bit more detail, but that's the question we're moving towards. First, though, speaking of people who have more or less disappeared from public attention, despite being absolutely impossible to avoid in the run-up to the referendum and in the immediate aftermath, Daniel Hannan, inevitably, because he has been proved wrong about everything, was put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson, and yesterday the Daily Mail paid him to offer up his opinions on two Labour politicians stating the obvious, that we need to have closer ties with our most geographically close trading partners. So Daniel Hannan has emerged from a richly deserved and self-imposed purdah to offer up his expert opinions on matters Brexit. So I thought it would be timely to remind ourselves of just how brilliant an analyst he has proved himself to be.
Outside the EU, Britain is the region's foremost knowledge-based economy. We lead the world in biotech, services, law, education, the audiovisual sector. Outside the EU's clinical trials directive, we're again at the forefront of medical research. Outside the EU's rules on data retention, Hoxton has become the software capital of Europe, the Silicon Valley of this part of the world. Outside the downright malicious rules on pensions, equity and insurance, our financial services are booming, not only in London, but in Edinburgh, Leeds and Birmingham. And our older industries have revived too. Our farmers, always more innovative than their continental rivals, are exporting all over the world. Our fishing grounds have once again become a great renewable resource. And outside the EU's energy boondoggles, fuel prices have fallen back to world levels, leading to a revival of our steel, cement, ceramics and plastics producers. Britain has raised its eyes to more global horizons. Yes, we still participate in the great European common market that stretches from non-EU Iceland to non-EU Turkey. But we've been able to lift our eyes to more distant, more opulent markets. Markets to which we're linked by custom and kinship, by language and law. Family incomes have received a triple boost. Food prices are lower outside the Common Agricultural Policy. Fuel bills are lower because energy prices have dropped to world levels, and taxes are lower because of the independence dividend. And that means more household income for everybody and a general stimulus to the entire economy. As the
Daniel Hannan there. What happened then at the end? It sounded like a remix. Am I on? Am I live? Good. Daniel Hannan there, reflecting upon where the country would be in June of 2025. So in his defence, there's still 18 months to go. And the Mail are still paying him for his insights and his opinions. And he sits in the House of Lords now. You need. It's hard to pick a single emblem of Brexit idiocy, like one person who best encapsulates the absolute congregation of circumstance, the reward of ignorance, the epic sense of entitlement, the arrogance that saw people think they understood issues better than people who'd spent their whole lives examining, exploring or living through those issues. And of course, the soft soaping, the belly tickling that they received from almost all of the British media, not just the print media. You couldn't get Hannan off this station at one point. People were queuing up to book him for his insights when he didn't even understand the barest consequences of what he was agitating for. And he's back. He's back in the Daily Mail offering up his opinions. And over at the Daily Telegraph, the sort of Charybdis of newspaper corruption to the Daily Mail Scylla. Over at the Daily Telegraph, there are calls for Rishi Sunak to be ousted, and they're coming from precisely that rump of the Tory movement that brought you Brexit. The headbangers, the weirdos, the misfits who have somehow ended up in complete control. Someone called Simon Clarke, who was Rishi Sunak's deputy at the Treasury, has written an article claiming that extinction is a very real possibility for the Tory party. It's been published under the guise of being news by the Telegraph alongside polling, apparently paid for by people linked to David Frost, but they won't tell us who, which frames such ridiculous questions. Utterly ridiculous questions. It says, would an unnamed Conservative leader who possessed superpowers and incredible gifts win your vote in a putative election, or would Keir Starmer? It's more or less that they've polled on. And obviously, Daily Telegraph readers or anybody polled has responded, oh yes, I like the sound of this mythical superhero. I definitely vote for him. So the idea that this is in any way built upon facts or evidence doesn't bear the barest scrutiny. And within hours of it being published, it's emerged that JCB have given £40,000 to the bloke who's launching the apparent putsch, or at least an attempt. He's floating the boat. He's raising the issue of the necessity of getting rid of Rishi Sunak. Oust Sunak or Tories will go extinct, warns former cabinet ally. Now go back 18 months and this fellow was number 2 to Rishi Sunak in the Treasury. So this notion of a circular firing squad where they keep missing each other, one of my favourite descriptions of British politics, even though it's my own, one of my favourite descriptions of British politics becomes more accurate by the day. The Conservative Party has turned into a circular firing squad where they just keep missing each other. It's absolutely surreal. And now, even to my surprise, they have from within someone who is described as a senior Tory, although they describe Lee Anderson as a senior Tory, so it's become a fairly meaningless descriptor latterly, is calling for a change of leadership. I don't have a particularly sophisticated question for you today, but I do have quite a strong opinion. I'm actually beyond amused by this now. You know that they say you should never interrupt your enemy while they're making mistakes. But if your enemy is running the country while making epic mistake after epic mistake after epic mistake, I think that amusement gives way pretty quickly to a sort of icy fury. I'm not allowed to swear on this programme, but the idea that any Conservative politician would look at the state of this country today and think, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to launch an entirely self-serving leadership campaign, or at least I'm going to start asking questions about the current leadership, because somehow that is more important than everything from the situation in the Middle East right through to the state of our waterways or our schools or our hospitals. I genuinely cannot get my head around how anybody in January of 2024 can be thinking, as a prominent politician on the public purse, can be thinking that my top priority now should be going after the leader of my own party, should be going after the Prime Minister. I understand self-interest, I understand self-absorption, I understand arrogance, I understand entitlement, I understand what happens to people when they walk through the doors of the House of Commons. It's like a Hogwarts effect where they begin to believe that they're magical creatures when in fact they're just wombats. I'm getting a lot of abuse for maligning wombats. I'll come up with a better description in a moment. But I even as a veteran watcher of British politics, and you'll allow me to remind you that since 2016 I've predicted almost every twist and turn of the national pageant accurately, up to and including the disgrace of Boris Johnson. What the fudge is going on here? Major right-wing newspaper, former number 2 in the Treasury, David Frost and a mysterious donor, all combining forces to try to get rid of Rishi Sunak. The question I've got for you is why? Why do these ghouls and vampires... Listen, I think Rishi Sunak's an absolute disaster. But if you want stability, the best available option at the moment, before they call the general election that they should frankly have called yesterday, is not to spend the next 2 months caught up in another internecine warfare prompted by the arrogance and self-absorption of right-wing Tory MPs. So why? Knowing what you know, seeing what you see, hearing what you hear. Why? Where is this coming from? The bloke that owns JCB has bunged 40 grand to a relatively nondescript Tory MP who styles himself as being to the right of the right of the right, voted against the Rwanda bill and is calling today in the pages of the Daily Telegraph for the Tories to get rid of Rishi Sunak. Why? Why? 0345 6060 973. What are they playing at? Because I don't, well, beyond the obvious answer of prioritising self-interest, self-advancement and attention-seeking over anything that remotely resembles the national interest, I don't know what these clowns are playing at, and I need you to tell me. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. Go on, have a crack, if you can, at explaining it. There's a so-called senior Tory, 40 grand in his back pocket from the owner of the JCB and a big cheerleading front page from the Daily Telegraph calling for Rishi Sunak to go or the Tories will be extinct. What's going on? 0345 6060 973. A couple of you clearly listening to a programme I was listening to this morning where it was suggested that it could have something to do with the imminent sale of the Daily Telegraph. Rishi Sunak will be making that decision, and are there people at the Daily Telegraph that would rather somebody else was in the chair when the decision was taken on whether or not the Daily Telegraph could be sold to Abu Dhabi interests? I don't know. I mean, we're never going to get to the bottom of anything like that. But it is frankly extraordinary, isn't it? To look at the state of the country today and then have someone called Simon Clarke popping up and squealing about how it's really important to get rid of Rishi Sunak. Unless, of course, you agree, in which case you're probably best placed to tell me or to answer the question on what the fudge is going on. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's the end of January 2024. We have to have an election before the end of this year, pretty much. The country is in dire straits, and the Tories are having another civil war. The Tories are having another civil war. What's happened to your party? If you are a Tory, and if you're not, what the fudge is going on? Matt's in Orpington. Matt, what would you like to say?
Oh, hey, James. Firstly, first-time caller.
Welcome.
Secondly, I moved back to the UK. I'm from London originally, but I moved back to the UK after spending almost 20 years living in Australia. I am Anglo-Australian.
Right.
And I have spent most of the time since 2017 to today in shock and horror.
At what you've come back to?
Yeah.
Do you know what you're like?
Somebody who's very nervous and scared and anxious.
No. I'm putting you at your ease without you even noticing now, Matt. You are like you're like a grandma who only sees her grandchildren sporadically. So you have noticed. You have noticed how much they've grown. You see, you've come to visit for Christmas, and you've said, "Are you pouring yourself a cup of tea while I'm talking?"
No, sorry, I'm making soup.
That's fine. You carry on. We'll talk about that in a moment. So you've come to visit for Christmas and you've said, they've grown. And Mum and Dad have gone, no, they haven't. They're the same size that they were yesterday. Because you've had that distance, you can actually track the decline much more effectively than those of us who've been living through it throughout have been able to.
I think you're completely right. I think there's something in that. And I think that as somebody who has two nationalities and a foot in both countries, if you like, some of the things I could see about Australia, people who were Australian born didn't want to see or were quite fearful of seeing, and exactly the same here. But to answer your question, we had a federal election in Australia in 2007, and we got rid of the Liberal National Coalition, which is the equivalent of the Conservative Party in the UK. Do not be fooled by the word Liberal.
Yeah.
And John Howard was ousted, and Kevin Rudd, the Australian Labor Party, were in. A few years later, due to internal fighting, domestic politics, and of course, it looked like Kevin Rudd wasn't doing very well and the Australian Labor Party were fearful. They got rid of Kevin Rudd and put his second-in-command, Julia Gillard, in place.
God, yes, of course.
And who really genuinely hurt me. I'm gay. Julia Gillard was the first female and the first atheist prime minister that Australia, I don't know, ever had or admitted to. But she stabbed the queer community in the back quite terribly. Anyway, a couple of years later, it looked like the Australian Labor Party were in for electoral wipeout. Julia Gillard was doing terrible in the polls. The rumour in Australia was that they were going to get rid of her and put Kevin Rudd back. And, of course, everybody was saying that would be crazy. That just wouldn't happen. It's bonkers. Maybe somebody different, but definitely we're not going to go backwards. And Kevin Rudd himself was on television all the time saying, this is not going to happen, I'm never going to do this. Julia Gillard was saying, of course, that would be stupid. I got on a flight from Melbourne to London, 24 hours, landed, and my mother said to me, hello, welcome home. Oh, and you've got a new Prime Minister, who actually isn't new, it's the old one. And I remember checking my phone thinking, oh my God, they actually did it. And the reason, fear.
Desperation.
Yeah, fear and desperation.
Fear of what? Fear of electoral wipeout, or fear of irrelevancy, or fear of both?
I think both, and of course a fear of ideological relevancy, because there are many Conservatives who are totally ideologically driven. They do believe in a very, very, very small state, low taxes if at all, low social services, and you look out for you, I look out. I apologise.
With that, you just swore. This is one of the most detailed contributions that we dumped it. Don't worry, no one heard you except me. But that do you know what that is? That's 20 years in Australia. That is. I don't think you'd get dumped. Seriously, on Australian radio at 26 minutes past 11 in the morning, they'd let that go. But not on.
They probably would.
Not on British radio. So you see echoes. I mean, you've got Murdoch in the picture as well, of course, in both of the countries that you describe, which is probably not irrelevant. But this is. I think I've seen Nadine Dorries suggesting that this is all part of a plan to bring David Cameron back. But if JCB bloke is involved, then the ghost of Boris Johnson just appeared at the banquet. Is that what you're saying?
I think be prepared for anything and everything. The Tories are fearful and the Tories are scared. We know that fear drives people into terrible positions. Fear drives people to otherisation. Fear drives people to hatred. Fear drives people to racism, and fear drives people to do shocking things and terrible things. And I genuinely think they are nervous and scared and anxious, and I think they know the writing is on the wall, and I think they know. I mean, I could be wrong, and I hope I'm not, but I think they know that the British public are.
This is a paroxysm of paranoia from the Tory right, and it is born of desperation and fear. And as you came very close to quoting Yoda, Matt, I shall give the full quote, which is: fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Fear, of course, is the path to the dark side. So it is like a cornered rat. It is a frightened, angry beast that is desperately lashing out in whatever direction it can reach. And that is going to be among the best analyses that we find, albeit with the little diversion into potty mouthness halfway through. Which I mention it because when we do a dump like that, then it puts a glitch in what you're listening to, and I don't want you to be left wondering what's going on. But certainly a good enough contribution to forgive the swear. Thank you, Matt. The number you need is 0345 60973. Emma says, terror, picking up on a similar theme, terror at irrelevancy, James. They're all utter puddings, and deep down they know it. They continually failed upwards. They got smacked by the Peter Principle, and now the sweet privilege of parliamentary prestige is disappearing over the horizon. It's the reflective gasp of a corpse. But none of this makes it any less pathetic. The reflexive gasp of a corpse. Yeah, I do this occasionally. I'm not going to lie to you. It hasn't worked recently as well as it has worked in the past. I suspect because of a combination of despair and lethargy. But if this is your party, how do you account for what is happening? Looking at the state of the party, the state of the nation, and seeing someone who until relatively recently was Rishi Sunak's number 2 in the Treasury, calling for him to be removed and replaced, can you explain to outsiders what has happened to your party? The number you need to do so, of course, is 0345 60973. Don't forget, PMQs on the way at 12. And before that, unless something goes horribly wrong, I think we're going to have time for a smear Keir and a woke watch. So, Keith, you better get your trigger finger ready. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It's 33 minutes after 11. I think there's something quite weird going on politically. And I might get into trouble actually for saying this. Not lots and lots of trouble, but it's a little bit self-defeating perhaps. But I think you might be really, really bored. I think things have possibly got so awful that you are struggling to care now, particularly about the governing party. And it means I'm doing you a bit of a disservice when I take my lead every morning from the right-wing newspapers. It has served us well over the years. hasn't it? You need to know what the enemy is thinking, and you need to get in front of them in order to hopefully rescue a few people from their grooming and gaslighting ways. But I think the Tories now are so unutterably awful. It's possible there's not a great deal to say about it. I mention this because, and I can only say this from a position of great arrogance, I have the busiest switchboard on British radio by some distance. And in the last hour, you would have struggled to get through. You may have discovered that for yourself. You would have struggled to get through to the programme. But latterly, there have been 2 or 3 occasions where conversations about the domestic political landscape are not tickling your fancy. I mean, imagine in 2022 if I'd said to you, everybody wants to talk about the Houthis in Yemen and nobody wants to talk about the government. You'd have laughed in my face, right? But and it's something we've talked about off air, actually. Just the sense that now things are so unutterably awful. No one's ringing me to defend them, which is always good value. But equally, pointing out how awful they are feels almost pointless. It feels like, yeah, whatever, James. The Pope's a Catholic and bears poo in the woods. And the Tories are... Have a listen to this bloke. I don't know if you've come across him before. This is someone called Ben Bradley, another good example of the sort of flotsam and jetsam that has risen to the surface of the Tory party post-2016, but particularly post-2019. Listen to the whole exchange. It was on the BBC Politics show yesterday with Joe Coburn. It is extraordinary now just how unutterably awful they all are. And I'm worried that it's reached saturation point where we look at each other. You send me messages saying, God, have you seen 30p Lee asking for his job back? And even I go, yeah, of course he is. 30p Lee didn't vote against the Rwanda bill because people started laughing at him. So he abstained, and now he's saying he wished he'd voted for it. And please, Rishi Sunak, can I have my job back? And these people aren't just poor politicians, they're pathetic human beings. I wonder whether... It's possible I'm doing my job bad. Poor old Tony in Tatton's waiting to come on, and I'm dedicating a 10-minute monologue to how nobody's ringing me. Listen, Tony, Robert, Joe, Dan, I hopefully will get... But I'm just saying, compared to normal service, compared even to a conversation about Houthi rebels in Yemen, the state of British politics does not seem to be exciting you in the way that it would have done a year ago, or even perhaps a month ago, and I'm wondering what's happened. So here's a bloke called Ben Bradley. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what constituency is unfortunate enough to have him as an MP. But listen to the glibness and the fluency with which he talks undiluted nonsense and then bats nary an eyelid when it is pointed out to him. He essentially has his pants pulled down on live television and pretends that everything is perfectly normal. This is extraordinary, but it's not extraordinary. It's perfectly ordinary.
Does he mean you, Ben, when he's talking about the weird McCarthyism, trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect?
Very vacuous nonsense, to be honest. The idea, and particularly because on a weekend where the Chancellor is talking about the economy and the headroom he's got to be able to support people and cut taxes, he's the one talking about the woke agenda. Nobody else was talking about it. Yeah. I do think that it speaks to a cultural challenge for Labour, actually, that when we've been discussing really important issues today, he's got no answers to those. He's got a rhetoric around things he thinks he can win on with a certain groups of people.
But Ben, you've been on this programme many times talking about exactly these issues. I mean, in November 2020, following a report on the connections between colonialism and properties now in the care of the National Trust, including links with historic slavery, you were among the signatories of a letter to the Telegraph accusing the National Trust of being coloured by cultural Marxist dogma, colloquially known as the woke agenda. You started it, to use that childish phrase.
I think, well, let's not get into who started it.
He went on to say that it's important. So it's vacuous nonsense that nobody's talking about when Keir Starmer says, would everyone just please grow up? And when it's pointed out to him that he was one of the idiots that was most prominent in calling for it to become a major national issue, he pretends that it's really important. I mean, the level of hypocrisy, cowardice, and idiocy now is so immense that I'm beginning to wonder whether you've stopped caring. So I say to you, what the hell is going on in the Tory party? And you say to me, I don't care, James. They are just so unutterably awful. There's no point even trying to analyse it. 11:38 is the time. It's just a thought. Anyway, no pressure, Tony, in Tatton. What's going on in the Tory party?
Well, I don't know what I can tell you because I'm in a good Tory constituency.
Well, it is now, but it did have that curious little adventure with Martin Bell, didn't it?
Do you want to go back that far?
No, I don't want to go back that far. I'm just showing off my political knowledge.
Because my son and I spent a lot of time going around the constituency taking down Martin Bell posters.
Did you really? As a die-hard Tory who was defending the honour of Neil Hamilton?
But I thought Neil Hamilton was a nice guy.
Good Lord.
And there is a book about it called, I don't know what it's called, but if you can find the book about it,
well, don't worry.
It's a good read, because I knew everybody in those days, including the local Tory.
So what's happened? What's happened to your party then?
Well, it's not done anything that interests the people who vote for them. If I go back over the years, I cannot think of I can think of one single thing that has been a benefit, and that was freeing pensions.
Right.
Because otherwise I would have had to have handed over my pension money for an annuity and got ripped off for 1% until I died.
Oh, fair enough. So you are unmoved by all of the Rwanda rhetoric and the attacks on the National Trust and the criticism of. Well, I mean, you're unmoved by everything, really.
Well, I'm generally... Well, I can be moved, but you've mentioned two good things, Nick, because I'm a member of the RNLI and I'm a member of the National Trust. I heard you the other day having a go at a National Trust bloke because he was only interested in the buildings and not the history of who paid for them.
No, that's not quite what happened, but
okay, vaguely, I was thinking about it.
Yes.
But you see, I'm very keen on these buildings, and I think they are part of our history. And yes, there is a relevance to who paid for them. Now, I live up north, but I visit friends in Surrey, and I go to one in Surrey, probably the one the bloke wouldn't refer to that his mother helps at. And I think there's one of them, I can't even tell you its name, but it's a lovely place in a park. A brewer in Scotland had a mistress who inherited all his wealth and became friends with the royal family.
That's just interesting.
And she was a real...
We're getting a bit off the message here. You're kind of proving the point I was making earlier, although not necessarily intentionally, Tony. What do we think about a Tory MP trying to get rid of Rishi Sunak today?
I'm not impressed.
No, I'm not impressed either. And why do we think he's doing it?
Well, I haven't a clue is the answer to that.
Yeah, this is why it's not working as a phone-in, Tony. Nobody cares, and the people who do care don't know.
Well, yes, I do care, actually.
But you don't know.
Because I care about people who are employed by the Treasury.
I care a bit.
Because one of my subjects is taxation.
Right.
And what concerns me is the tax system is so appallingly ineffective to make people work. It's ridiculous.
Well, there are issues they could be addressing, but I think that if we divide the country into people who don't care about what the Conservatives are up to now and people who do, then all of the people who do, like you, will not know what it is that they're currently playing at. Why is Simon Clarke, formerly of the Treasury, trying to oust Rishi Sunak, formerly Chancellor of the Exchequer, die-hard, lifelong Tory Tony in Tatton, all the T's, hasn't got a Scooby-Doo, hasn't got a... How are you going to vote if that's not an impertinent inquiry, sir?
I care to the extent I almost don't care, if you see what I mean.
I do, yes. That's it. You've nailed it. That's what I was trying to say, that you care to the point where you don't care. I care, but it's just so what's the point of chronicling all this awfulness? A bloke on the telly literally saying, well, this is all ridiculous. Nobody cares about all these culture wars. And someone reminds him he was one of the key conductors of culture. Well, that's because it's all very important. Jacob Rees-Mogg now reduced to shouting at stately homes and cheerleading for a sex offender. What do you do? Have you turned up? I don't know. Tony, take care. We'll talk again. Hopefully not about Neil Hamilton. Robert's in East Grinstead. What's going on, Robert?
Hello, James. Hello. Thanks for doing what you do.
I'm not doing it very well at the moment, Robert. I mean, there's something odd is happening. There's a dissipation of concern, as Tony put it. I care so much, I don't care. I can't pin it down. Anyway, why did you ring it?
I would, in a nutshell, the reason that I think that Rishi is being removed by, or attempting to be, this MP is attempting to remove him, is that MP has lost touch of some of their voters who are compromisers. The MPs that in the Conservative Party, I mean, the opposition does its job, but the MPs in the Conservative Party are constantly trying to undermine Rishi Sunak. On one level, they don't seem to know what they actually want, and the second, that they've actually lost sight of people in their own party who used to vote for them. You will know that Labour and Conservative voters for example, voted to leave the EU in 2016. I was a Remain voter.
Sure.
But, then we got obsessed for a long while with deal or no deal. The key reason why
I was with Stephen Mulhern yesterday. He's a lovely bloke. We were at the Toy and Game Fair at Kensington Olympia, launching the new Look Mystery Hour board game. And he now presents Deal or No Deal, of course. But I digress slightly.
Well, that sounds a lot more fun.
Well, it is a lot. It is a lot. So what you're suggesting is that they've had their brains boiled by 7 years of essentially binary warfare.
Yeah, they've just lost track of what is going on in the real world. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak is more clued in. I think Rishi Sunak is actually showing a lot of guts at the moment.
Do you?
In doing what he's... Yeah, I do.
In which bit? In Yemen?
Well, no, I think the thing is...
I'm going to disagree with you on this, but not violently.
I'm sure you are. I know you are.
I could speak positively of some Tories, and I have done over the years, and I've spoken very negatively about Labour leaders, but Rishi Sunak's messing everything up at the moment, Rob.
Well, I don't think he is. I'll do his defence for him and just go back in time for you a bit.
Okay.
In that run-up to that vote to leave the European Union in 2015, when it was being actively debated on TV, and you did as well, I never actually heard anyone in the pub or round a table before that vote was made saying, oh my God, I wish we could get a better deal with the EU. Oh God, I'm really held back by...
People claimed but people claimed that other people were being beset by red tape, and their brother-in-law's business had been closed down by Brussels, and they were building transit vans in Turkey, and that meant that Dagenham people. I mean, there was all sorts of nonsense out there, wasn't there? And none of it really got nailed down. But we haven't nailed down the malaise at the heart of the Tory party. I think we might have nailed down why people increasingly don't care about it. But it's why that line from Starmer about bald men fighting over a comb was quite effective last week as we head to this week's PMQs. It's as if they're having furious rows and the neighbours are just tuning it out now.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, my fatigue with life is difficult at the moment. I would say, I have a clean criminal record. I find life hard work. I find it really hard work. I find, I know that the cost of living crisis is partly energy companies sending people faulty billing. I know that, which is exhausting.
Okay.
I know that I got a fine the other day for doing 24 miles an hour on an empty road on a Sunday morning.
How are you supposed to care about Simon Clarke's attempt to oust Rishi Sunak?
Exactly. In this context, I think the public is being killed. A lot of the public is being killed by 1,000 little cuts, and they find that hard work.
I think that's really well put, actually. Just that idea of, it's tricky territory for me because this is my bread and butter. This is my living. I love talking about politics, but there are moments now, particularly since the new year turned, and this knowledge that there's an election on the way, somehow, somewhere. I kind of thought the stuff that would have got me bouncing up and down with excitement, like that clip of this Bradley buffoon falling apart live on television. It's and like Rees-Mogg being reduced to shouting at stately homes and cheerleading for a sex offender. It's as if, I don't know, it's as if you've been waiting for all the chickens to come home to roost, and then they've come home to roost, and you're just looking at a hat full of chickens. All right, yeah, okay, so we were right about everything. And if you're a Tory, it's just too awful to contemplate. It's like, I can't believe it. I can't believe how terrible it is. So do you know what? I'm not going to think about it. We need to get an actual phone-in out of this. Maybe tomorrow or Friday. I can't do it like that. I can't say, are you bored rigid with politics? I don't think. I could do, are you feeling yourself? Because it'll all come back again when the election gets underway. Don't worry. It's not a permanent condition that we're describing. But do you recognise what I'm describing and what Robert is describing, and even to a degree what Tony up in Tatton was describing? Do you feel a sense of atrophy creeping in? Not just for the government, actually. I think Labour are suffering from sort of second-hand atrophy as well. I think that we're buried in it now. It's almost like we've had our fill. Oh, what's happened now? Oh, another leadership bid at the Tory. Oh, okay. Oh, I think I'll have a biscuit. 11:52 is the time. If I did just accidentally ask you whether you were feeling yourself at the moment, please don't reply to tell me to answer that. It was an accident. I didn't mean to ask that question, and I'm really not interested in your answers. There is something odd going on, I think. I haven't quite pinned it down yet. It might be this, James. It's what happens to people in abusive, coercive relationships. After years, you go numb. We are all worn down by 14 years of lying, corrupt, gaslighting Tory government. Well, listen, I'm not defending what happened prior to 2016, but things have gone considerably worse since then. Sue says, James, it just feels like Groundhog Day. Each drama is now just blending in to the next one. And on the broader question of what's going on, Dom suggests these folks all just want to join reform, destroy the Conservative Party, and it's the only place where the headbangers can go. I don't know. I mean, I've been hearing for years how a far-right party is about to rewrite the rules of British politics, but all it's really done is make Nigel Farage rich and famous and bring the country to its knees without changing the two-party system in the UK Parliament at all. In 11:53 is the time. What's happened? And I haven't got the question right yet. I will next week probably, about this sense of atrophy, if that's the right word, or numbness almost. Ellie's in Kilburn. I'm not going to ask if you're feeling numb, Ellie. I'm going to ask what's going on.
Hi, James. My take on this is that it's just so overwhelming. The amount of destruction and shredding of the social services and the economy's flat and there's wars all over. It's just too much for our brains to cope with. That's my take on it. A bit like global warming is too much for a lot of people's brains, so they just go, la, 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 can't cope.
Yes.
Let's get on with our daily life.
So Robert described it as 1,000 cuts, a sort of form of, you might describe it as political consciousness dying by 1,000 cuts. You couple in exhaustion at the daily grind. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's research yesterday regarding poverty was heartbreaking. And I mean, who has got the bandwidth, the energy or the time to engage in Simon Clarke's political shenanigans this morning? Answer, nobody.
I think if they were planning to do this, they've played a blinder because they've pushed so many people financially to the limit. And now physically we're pushed to the limits by trying to run and run and run just to stand still and keep a roof over our heads and pay for their children's shoes and keep enough food on the table. But actually all of this nonsense that they keep coming, all this gaslighting nonsense that they keep coming up with is so far removed from people's everyday experience. Of course we don't care anymore. It's just... I've been to the Houses of Parliament once, right? And it was when they had to go through that airport-style security and you walk around with a little tag round your neck with a photo of who you are, saying you're a visitor. Yes. And it's like stepping into another country. And I think...
Another dimension.
Yeah, they feel themselves completely in another world. And they feel themselves... they're so far removed from everyday life.
Whispering plots and conspiracies in the corridors of those buildings feels really, really important. And sometimes it is, but it's now the whispering's been done by such inadequates that we've just switched. I mean, who the hell cares what Lee Anderson has got to say about anything? And yet my news is full of it.
And they all got in on this wave of bitter, angry gammons who still are bitter and angry and are just
and always will be bitter and angry. They'll always be bitter and angry. Do you know what the Daily Mail's telling them to be angry about today, Ellie?
Lay it on me, James.
The fact that adverts are not as sexy as they were in the 1970s.
Oh, for God's sake.
And it's all... do you know why that adverts are not as sexy as they were in the 1970s?
Tell me.
It's because of the woke.
Not because sexy adverts made women feel undermined and more vulnerable on the streets.
Well, that is exactly what wokeness sounds like, Ellie, as you well know.
Oh, God, it just makes you want to pull your teeth out.
Well, you have to, because they've also ruined dentistry.
Exactly.
Thank you, Ellie. I might squeeze in a woke watch, actually, before we introduce Natasha Clark into the studio, because I was actually going to do this today.
Woke watch.
The ads, so smart, sexy and funny, they would never, in capital letters, get made today, ... Thanks to the po-faced wokery that's made modern adverts as dull as they are preachy. So this is a piece, 2 pages in the Daily Mail, harking back to the days when Benson and Hedges featured some pyramids, when Cadbury's Smash featured some aliens, and when Guinness had some horses dancing over surfers. And the reason why you don't have adverts like that anymore, not to mention the slightly objectifying ones that Ellie referred to, is because of the woke. It's because of po-faced woke. So we've got to get people angry about wokery. And then someone in the building says, there's no such thing. And it's just not woke. Well, just get me something. Bring me something woke that I can get the readers angry about. And someone said as a joke, OK, how about 40-year-old adverts that aren't on telly anymore? Why aren't they on telly anymore? Woke! Po-faced wokery! So congratulations to Christopher Stevens for having the guts to put his name to this bilge.
Woke watch.
Quite like to do a Keir smear. Keir smear? Smear Keir as well, but I don't think we've got time. We shall see. There's a brilliant smear Keir in the Mail today. I mean, it's a masterpiece of the genre. But Natasha Clark is here, and it would be rude not to notice. Natasha, hello.
Morning.
PMQs. Last week was the bald men arguing over a comb. This week, a bald man has started arguing over Rishi Sunak's comb.
Well, he's got a bit of hair as Simon Clark.
It's a metaphor. All of the people that Keir Starmer was referring to.
He's got a bit of hair.
It's a metaphor. Okay. All the people that Keir Starmer was referring to last week have got hair, but they are arguing over a comb.
They are indeed. I think if I was a Keir Starmer, I might spend a lot of time just reading out lots of snippets from Simon Clark's Telegraph piece today.
Is Simon Clark important enough for Keir Starmer to use him as, or is he more of a Anthony? Well, he's not even a stalking horse yet, is he?
No, it's not like a lot of our listeners will go, of course, so Simon Clark, that very well-known Conservative, but he is quite senior. Obviously, he did used to be a cabinet member, and he does have a sir in front of his name, so he can't
Everyone
be completely
has a
nobody.
Sir. Jacob Rees-Mogg has a sir
That's
in front
true.
of his name these days, and Andrea Jenkins is a dame.
It's true.
So it's not really a handle that denotes much anymore, certainly not authority, integrity or achievement. But will Starmer go in on this? Would he go in on the internecine warfare? He can't go near international relations because they're still singing from the same hymn sheet.
I think he'll go on his knife crime stuff, which he's been talking about this week, because obviously we've got crime stats out tomorrow. Labour doing this big crime push. We've obviously had the really shocking murder case that's been in the court lately of, sadly, 2 people that were killed by a man in a knife crime attack. So I think if I was Starmer, I might go on something like that. But if I were him, I would probably use at least one question to bash them on Simon Clark.
And Sadiq Khan been sort of in a bit of a to-do with James Cleverly over the speed with which legislation is brought in. So Starmer, you think, will get involved in that?
Yes, and he's planning to go further. He wants to ban these zombie knives, which the government have obviously been talking about for quite a long time. They apparently are this week bringing forward finally the legislation on that, but they want to go further. Labour say they're going to ban all kinds of knives and swords and go even further than the Conservatives. And it is obviously going to be an important battleground crime for the next election. And whether it's up, whether it's down, which figures and statistics you use, everywhere in the country is affected by this kind of knife crime. Obviously, it'll be a key battleground as well for London, and something that the idea that, again, it's another traditionally Conservative battleground, isn't it? And Labour going in on it, I think, means quite a lot for where the party are at this point in time. The fact that Labour feel confident enough to go in and say, actually, yes, under us, we would be tough on crime.
He's done quite a lot of it, hasn't he? He's moved on to Tory territory quite a lot. And surprisingly for some, and I guess the Simon Clark story today is evidence of it, the Tories move further, they tack further to the right rather than locking horns on the centre ground. And
That's what a lot of Conservative MPs are saying. Look at how Reform are shooting up the poll agenda. Actually, we need to go further to the right on immigration, further on these issues if we're going to out-reform. But for a lot of people, they say, well, actually, Keir Starmer's moving us further away. Is that really the right way to go?
Yeah, it's a very bad miscalculation by Tories because they're currently in government. When they're in opposition, they can make all the racist rhetoric they want and go toe-to-toe with Farage and the other fella. But when they're in government, they have to follow up the racist rhetoric with legislation. And, of course, they often can't do that and end up trying to do so by claiming that an unsafe country is safe and insisting that it becomes safe just because we say so. Quite significant that the House of Lords kicked that plan into temporary touch yesterday.
Yes, although in reality that doesn't do a lot. It basically just says that the Rwanda plan and the Rwanda treaty, rather, should not come into effect until other safeguards are met. And in reality, what it
Safeguards defined in their own legislation.
Yes.
Or in their own plan. So you can't do it until the things you say need to happen for Rwanda to become safe have actually happened. And the government will respond by saying, well, no, they don't.
Well, exactly. All the government will do is put a piece of paper down saying, actually, we don't.
Safe.
We don't. Everything's fine.
We don't need to meet our own safeguards.
Rwanda's very safe.
And then, of course, the question of, it's like a race, isn't it? The Rwanda legislation and the general election are sort of going
exactly which one's going
to happen first, or which one's going to reach first. Anything else apart from knives and possibly internecine warfare?
Knives, Sir Simon Clarke. I wonder if Rishi Sunak would like to, if obviously he's not having a great week, distract us all by talking about the National Trust and that so-called anti-woke speech that we got from Sir Keir Starmer.
Let's find out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about His Majesty the King and Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, and in his comments about Holocaust Memorial Day? Never again must be said more defiantly this year as it's said every year. Mr. Speaker, last week we lost Sir Tony Lloyd, a true public servant who touched the lives of many people across the House and across the country. And I'm glad that his family were here yesterday to hear the many tributes to and memories of Tony. He will be greatly missed. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's had quite a week, from endlessly fighting with his own MPs to collapsing in laughter when he was asked by a member of the public about NHS waiting lists. So I was glad to hear that he managed to take some time off.
Can I just say, I wanted to the Prime Minister, I'm certainly going to hear the Leader of the Opposition. Those people who don't want to hear, they can certainly leave, because that's how it's going to be, so get it in order. Some of you are wanting to catch my eye again. It's not a good way to do it.
Mr. Speaker, I love this quaint tradition where the more they slag him off behind his back, the later they cheer in here. Keep it going.
And also, for this side, you can have a joint cup of tea. Come on.
Mr. Speaker, I was glad to see that he managed to get some time off yesterday afternoon to kick back, relax, and accidentally record a candid video for Nigel Farage. The only thing missing from that punishing schedule is any sort of governing or leadership. So was he surprised to see one of his own MPs say that he doesn't get what Britain needs and he's not listening to what people want?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about what Britain needs, what Britain wants, what Britain values. This from a man who takes the knee, Mr. Speaker, who wanted to abolish the monarchy, who still doesn't know what a woman is, and who just this week, one of his front benchers said that they back teaching divisive white privilege in our schools, Mr. Speaker. Looking at his record, it's crystal clear which one of us doesn't get Britain's values.
Mr. Speaker, he spouts so much nonsense, no wonder they're giving up on him. And even now, as his government crumbles around him and his own MPs point out he's out of touch, got no plan for growth, crime or building houses, the Prime Minister is sticking to his one-man Pollyanna show. Everything's fine. People should be grateful to him. The trouble is, no one's buying it. Does he actually understand why his own MPs say he doesn't understand Britain and that he is an obstacle to recovery?
Prime Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, he calls it nonsense, but these are his positions, Mr. Speaker. Right? And he doesn't want to talk about it, but this is the facts. He chose to represent a now proscribed terrorist group, Mr. Speaker. He chose to campaign against the deportation of foreign national offenders, Mr. Speaker, just like he chose to serve the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, Mr. Speaker. That's his record, those are his values, and that is exactly how he should be judged.
Mr. Speaker, in 2008, I was the Director of Public Prosecution, putting terrorists and murderers in jail. He was making millions betting on the misery of working people during the financial crisis. And we've seen this story time and time again with this lot. party first, country second, safely ensconced in Westminster, they get down to the real business of fighting each other to death. The country forced to endure their division and chaos, the longest episode of EastEnders ever put to film. Meanwhile, this week we discover that Britain is going to be the only major economy that no longer makes its own steel. That the government is handing out £500 million to make 3,000 steelworkers redundant. And that the parents of thousands are being told that his free childcare promise is nothing but a mirage. Isn't he embarrassed that the Tory party is yet again entirely focused on itself?
Mr. Speaker, there's yet more sniping from the sidelines. Yeah, you can see. Yeah, you can see exactly why Hizb ut-Tahrir hired him in the first place. But he wants to talk about these things. Even his own party are now realising that he simply doesn't have a plan for this country, Mr. Speaker. The member for Dagenham and Raynham said it's difficult to identify the purpose of his leadership. And long-time celebrity backer Steve Coogan recently said he licks his finger, sticks it in the air, and just sees which way the wind is blowing. Even Labour Party know, Mr. Speaker, he's not a leader, he is a human weather vane.
It's not the sidelines, it's behind him that the fire's coming in, Mr. Speaker. And he can try and blame the Labour Party all he wants. The difference is, I've changed my party, he's bullied by his party. And has he found the time in his busy schedule to work out why thousands of parents are being told by their nurseries that they won't get free childcare that he promised them?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's see what his party is offering the country. It's great, right? So we all know, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't have many ideas for our country.
I'm going to hear the Prime Minister.
Well, he doesn't have many, but one thing we do know, Mr. Speaker, is that...
You don't want to push it, do you? No.
We do know that he's committed to his 2030 decarbonisation promise, Mr. Speaker, which they say will cost £28 billion. But I was reading about it this week. He says he's changed the party. One of his team called it an albatross hanging around their neck. That might have been the Shadow Chancellor, maybe, Mr. Speaker. But he said they're doubling down on it. All this ahead of a crunch meeting, we're told this week, for them to work out how they're going to pay for it. I can save them some time because we all know the answer. Higher taxes for the British people.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that crashed the economy. They're sitting right there.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, you've had your question already. Obviously, you don't want to remain for the rest of it. Here's Salma.
He is Mr. 25 tax rises. And he's got nothing to say on childcare. Millions of families will have been listening for an answer, and they got absolutely nothing. He announced that scheme a year ago, claiming it would get 60,000 parents back into work. Only on Monday of this week did he notice there was some, in his words, practical issues with that. 8 weeks before its launch, parents can't budget, plan for work, or make arrangements with their employers. And the Prime Minister's response is to say, it's all fine, it's the fault of the Labour Party. Is this merely a practical issue, or is it yet another example of him simply not understanding how life works for other people?
Mr. Speaker, we're delivering the biggest ever expansion of childcare in this country's history, Mr. Speaker. But while millions of parents will benefit from that, again, it's right that he should come clean with them about the cost that his plans will impose on all of them. He goes on and on about the Green Promise, Mr. Speaker. He says he wants to keep it. But he doesn't have a plan to pay for it. What he's really saying is he'll scrap the borrowing associated, but he wants to keep the £28 billion of spending. So, for all those working families who are benefiting from our free childcare, he should come clean with them now. Why doesn't he come clean with them now? Come clean with them now and just be clear, his plan's mean back to square one and higher taxes for British people.
Mr. Speaker, making steelworkers redundant and failing to provide childcare is not a plan, Prime Minister. It's a farce. It's a farce. And he may soon discover that with childcare, there's an IT problem. Nurseries haven't got the spaces. They haven't got the staff. There's a black hole in their budget, and it's 8 weeks to go. That isn't a plan. And families across the country, well, they can laugh all they like. Families are making plans now. They laugh at it, of course they do. Families are struggling with a cost of living crisis, trying to work out the household budget, balancing spiralling mortgages, prices and eye-watering bills. And then at the last minute, they're thrown into chaos because their nursery says they can't deliver the free childcare he promised. Now, he calls that a practical issue. But I preferred the honesty of whichever of his colleagues briefed to the Times that it was, and I quote, a complete shit show. Who was it who briefed that to the Times? Hands up. Will the Prime Minister finally realise...
I'll decide how long the question goes. Those who wish don't hear it, I've told you the answer, and I'll help you on the way. Keir Starmer.
When will the Prime Minister finally realise that the biggest practical issue facing Britain is the constant farcical incompetence of the government that he leads?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker. Another week with no ideas, absolutely no ideas as country, and absolutely no plan. He talked about the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, he talked about the economy, but he never actually brings it up, and we all know why, Mr. Speaker, because things are improving and we are making progress. Wages now rising, Mr. Speaker, debt on track to be reduced, and inflation more than halved from 11% to 4%, because he actually knows that our plan is working and that his £28 billion tax grab will take Britain back to square one. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the choice. It's back to square one and higher taxes with him, or a plan that's delivering a brighter future with the Conservatives.
Changing gear, Mr. Speaker. Too many oligarchs and kleptocrats are living off ill-gotten gains beyond the reach of domestic courts here or in countries like America. Ever since the 2016 London Anti-Corruption Summit, moves to create an international anti-corruption court have been gathering momentum to plug this gap. It already has support from countries like Canada, Holland and Nigeria, and would fund itself from the fines it charged. Will this government take the lead in getting it underway, ending impunity for these crooks once and for all?
Well, can I firstly pay tribute to my honourable friend for his work on this issue? As I'm sure he'll appreciate, establishing a new bespoke institution is a significant endeavour, but I know he's discussed it with the Foreign Secretary, who will look at the proposals in more detail. And in the meantime, as he knows, our Economic Crime Act has a raft of new measures to crack down on dirty money, and we will shortly be publishing our second anti-corruption strategy. Will set out ambitious plans for combating corruption, both here at home but also internationally.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, last night, as Tory MPs were once again fighting amongst themselves, the public were sat at home watching John Irvine of ITV News report on footage from Gaza of an unarmed Palestinian man walking under a white flag, being shot and killed by the IDF. Prime Minister, such an act constitutes a war crime, does it not?
Mr. Speaker, we've been absolutely consistent that international humanitarian law should be respected and civilians should be protected. I've made that point expressly to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Foreign Secretary is in the region this week making exactly the same point.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to rise to that dispatch box and tell the people of these Isles and elsewhere that shooting an unarmed man walking under a white flag is a war crime. Now, in recent weeks, this House has acted with urgency and intent following an ITV drama. The question is, will this House now show the same urgency and intent following this ITV news report, and finally back a ceasefire in Gaza?
Mr. Speaker, no one wants to see this conflict go on for a moment longer than necessary, and we do want to see an immediate and sustained humanitarian pause to get more aid in and, crucially, the hostages out, helping create the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire. I set out the conditions for that earlier in the House. The Foreign Secretary is in the region today and will continue to press all our allies and partners to make sure that we can bring about that outcome.
Tom Hunt. Speaker, access to NHS dentistry is a key issue in Ipswich.
12:17 is the time, and Stephen Flynn once again making quite a very powerful intervention after possibly some more evidence of the fatigue that we were discussing earlier being provided by Rishi Sunak, certainly, and to a lesser extent possibly even Keir Starmer. I will pick over the bones of what we've just heard with Natasha Clark after this. 20 minutes after 12. We must take a moment to, I don't know whether it's to apologise or to acknowledge that we just had, this could have ended horribly. Apparently if you were following this on the LBC live feed, you were watching me instead of watching PMQs, and possibly Natasha as well. Careers have ended as a consequence of technological glitches like that. I mean, what if I had been caught doing something inappropriate or obscene? Nothing to do with Keith, says Keith, but then he would, wouldn't he? I'm not quite sure whose head is going to roll as a consequence of this appalling oversight. But if you did have my live reactions to PMQs inflicted upon you instead of actually being able to watch the action live from the chamber, then I can only apologise. Natasha, of course, has to put up with it every week.
I just get to look at you laughing every time.
I do
Keir
laugh
Starmer makes a nice joke.
I do increasingly laugh at PMQs, but not necessarily.
It's a bit goggle-boxy, isn't it?
Yes.
I think we could make it work.
Do you think we should do it? What would you rather watch, PMQs or listen to PMQs while watching Natasha and I react? Yes. Well, I noticed that you're keen to avoid the discussion that now follows because I don't remember much mention of knives.
No, sorry, completely. 0 point for that. Well, no, I did say Simon Clarke, and obviously that was a really obvious one,
that was a little bit like,
but,
suggesting there'd be a ball on a football pitch.
But that was a really dirty Prime Minister's questions, wasn't it? It felt really low, yes. I think, for both sides. From Sunak, it's setting out the battlegrounds for the next election, isn't it? This is exactly what we can expect for probably the next 6 months. Taxes, he's going to put up your taxes. He's a risk. Jeremy Corbyn, 28 billion spending. His record as DPP. He's got no plan. And then from Starmer, it's obviously, he's already put up your taxes. Tory infighting, everything's awful. He's crashed the economy. Nothing works. Chaos and division. Rinse and repeat.
And if you had to pick a moment of particular absurdity, Rishi Sunak criticising the leader of the opposition for sniping from the sidelines.
Isn't that the whole point of Prime Minister's questions, a bit of sniping from the sidelines?
Quite sure what else they're supposed to do, really, apart from take over, but they can't do that unless Rishi Sunak calls a general election.
And we've got a new nickname for Sir Keir Starmer, which I've just invented, Sir Sweary, because he accidentally let slip.
Turned into Lee Anderson, you're inventing words. Did he?
Yeah, he did.
Which one?
The S word.
Did he really?
Yeah, at the very end.
What? I missed that completely.
He said the government is an S show.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Gosh.
Sir Sweary, that's my name.
That is Sir Sweary.
I like that. Can I have that one?
Yes, of course you can.
But yeah, it was a pretty lively one, considering. Keir, like you said before, is getting into these Prime Minister's questions, isn't he? He's enjoying them much more.
He is enjoying them. You can see that.
The lines
are
better
because you're watching me, but people will be able to see that when they watch it.
You hear it. It was good. You could hear in his voice he's becoming more confident. And actually, in some of his articles today, I noticed he started to say, I think, as Prime Minister, he is now starting to get a little bit towards that complacency end of the scale of if not when. When I become, that used to be the thing. And now he's saying, well, when I'm Prime Minister, as Prime Minister, I'll do this, this and this. And I think he's getting to that stage now.
He took Sunak by surprise, I think. I mean, the childcare stuff he didn't seem prepared for, but going in quite hard and quite low meant Sunak had to come back 2 or 3 times with the same sort of litany of if in case of emergency break glass and Jeremy Corbyn is behind the glass. He's literally thrown Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party. I worry, and I mean I say this as a sort of observer of democracy and a fan of elections. I can't quite yet imagine who it is that Sunak thinks he's going to appeal to with this line that isn't already behind him, that isn't already on side.
Which line?
The line about Starmer being doing some lawyering when he was a lawyer, or I mean, the sort of smear Keir type stuff. If on social media, these are people who've got pictures of Boris Johnson in their profiles who are sharing that stuff. I don't know that anybody normal or sensible is going to be persuaded by it.
I mean, Keir's whatever, even if it is quite tricky to explain it when you're in Prime Minister's questions and they're chucking these insults at each other. But Keir does have an answer.
Yes.
I was locking terrorists and murders up while he was raking in loads of money for billionaires.
Yes, which is just true. That's not an opinion. That's just counting. He was making a ton of money by betting on the financial crisis, and Starmer was locking up terrorists.
That's a good argument, I think, for them to make.
Yes.
But I think what is more difficult for Sir Keir Starmer to make is exactly why he was working with what people obviously say are controversial groups and how the legal process works. It's quite a difficult argument to make. And in a campaign trail, it's easy to just throw it out there.
Yes.
As you worked with this. Obviously, the terror group, which the name of which...
Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Yes,
they weren't a terror group then.
They weren't a terror group at the time. They are...
So Starmer was policing the parameters of free speech and freedom of expression. But as you say... That's hard to explain in the context when people like Sunak are cynically pretending not to understand that and trying to create the idea that he was somehow on the same side as this pretty grim Islamist group.
He did defend them, and I think there will be people that will go, well, yes, I'm worried the fact that he did defend a group who are now considered to be a dodgy terror group. Like, that is a completely legitimate argument for many people to make, but it is a very complicated issue.
And you can expect him to make it many, 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 many times because there's not a great deal else to do, which is why we've even come up with a little jingle, you see. So I wonder whether we're going to have to play this every single week at PMQs. Whenever Rishi Sunak gets to his feet, we might have to hit one of these.
Sneak here, sneak here, sneak here.
It's becoming government policy, really. It started off as a radio feature.
I like it.
It's nice, isn't it?
It's jolly.
It is. What else came up?
Childcare, obviously, like you say, came up again and again.
What's the story, Natasha?
So, story on this one was on the front page of the Times earlier this week that the government's childcare policy is not ready, which I think will not be a surprise to anybody who remembers it when it was announced. It's massive expansion of free childcare hours for parents with young children. At the moment, it's just, I think, the parents of 3 and 4-year-olds all get, I think, between 15 and 30 hours of free childcare. They're going to expand it to parents of 2-year-olds and then later this year to parents of anybody over 9 months old. It's a lot, but there just isn't the capacity in the childcare system for these places. And the government and local authorities still yet haven't told them how much money they are going to get per child for something that's meant to be coming in April.
Do we have an idea of how big a mess it is? So there's two messes. There's the logistical mess and the political mess. And we won't know how big the political mess is until we know how big the logistical mess is. But is there a realistic prospect of people expecting to be dropping their children off childcare, not being able to do so come May?
No, that won't happen just because of the way that the childcare system works is you have to have a place and you can only have a place for so many free hours of childcare per week. It is a very complicated system to navigate, but the childcare providers at the moment are going, well, actually, we don't know how much we're going to get paid, so therefore we can't allocate how many children will be in our care, and we don't know if we're going to be able to provide, if as a nursery you do not have to provide this free childcare if you do not have the capacity. But the fact is, another example of the government making these big promises but then coming down to it, they've not got the capacity there, they're not saying exactly how much this will all cost, and obviously it's going to be a thing that they want to come in to force this year. It's meant to be coming in April. It's only a few months away from that big moment. It was unveiled as the big part of the budget last year. And Sir Keir Starmer rightly saying, well, actually, you did promise all of this stuff, and it's not happening.
Who will know? Who will know all the details of this?
The childcare providers have been speaking about this.
Is it a topic, do you think? Should we be talking about it?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Childcare providers, I'm sure, will come on and tell you that it's a very complicated formula that's used. It's been tragically underfunded for a long, long time.
Of course.
Because government and local authorities will allocate a specific amount of money per child. And they say it's not enough in order to, and childcare is so expensive, isn't it?
It adds to the thing we were talking about earlier, this idea, it's another mess. And there'll be some people just rolling their eyes now, unless you've got skin in the game, or rather a child in need of care. Yeah. You'll be going, they've messed that up as well. It's almost sort of got, not post office flavoured feeling to it, but just everything's wrong. Everything
taps into this air of everything in this country. Broken Britain. Nothing
someone should write a book. What would be a good title? What would be a good title?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
It would be How They Broke Britain. Back in the Sunday Times top 10 this week, I hear. But I will have to wait and see, I suppose. Coming up to 12:30. Thank you, Natasha. And a quick word on Stephen Flynn. Powerful. and correct. I think the IDF, as they almost inevitably would, whatever the circumstances, are denying or will deny that they know anything about what actually happened. But the site footage, some people will have seen it, albeit not on not on the BBC. I think ITV had the footage of a man waving a white flag being shot dead, apparently by an IDF sniper. Sunak just ignored the question, really, didn't he?
Yeah, government going to come under increasing pressure around Israel's actions as this war goes on. And, David Cameron's in the region at the moment having talks, and he's going to have some really, really uncomfortable discussions with people like Netanyahu, who obviously many people in the region think he's got to be on the way out if this war is going to come to an end, and what happens next for Israel, Gaza and the wider region.
Natasha Clark, thank you very much. It's just gone 12:30, and Amelia Cox has your headlines. 12:34 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And I like this new sort of Wednesday flavour that we have. Instead of trying to return to topics that we've talked about previously on Wednesdays or stringing out PMQs interminably, if there are interesting people around who are doing and have done interesting things, we try to get them into the studio. I'll introduce you to the first shortly. And after 12:45, Alan Rusbridger, the editor of Prospect, will join us. He's just written a mammoth 6,000-word piece about the capture of the BBC. And both Alan Rusbridger, writing about the BBC, and Satnam Sanghera, writing a new book, Empire World. You may have read Empire Land. He takes his historical magnifying glass and now explores the impact of empire internationally, as opposed to domestically, the legacy as much as the impact. You've both been helped out by events this week, because Keir Starmer's brought elements of the culture war that play a smallish part in what you've written about back into the spotlight. And of course, the Tories have been touring studios accusing the BBC of being biased against them, when Alan has written an extraordinary article about how the whole corporation has been effectively colonised, to use an appropriate word, colonised by the Conservative Party. So let's begin at the beginning. Empire Land was an extraordinary success and a beautiful book. Born of what? What was for people who haven't read it, what was the intent that you framed as a newspaper columnist, not accepting or giving in to the temptation of just punting out a few collected columns for beans and dollars, but writing a proper, heavily researched history book?
I guess I just realised that Empire explained so many things about me as a Sikh in Britain, my very existence, and I hadn't been taught much about it. And then I realised lots of other people knew almost nothing about it either. So it was an attempt to educate myself, but hopefully I brought along readers with me.
Well, you have. I mean, to the point where it's now on curricula.
Yeah, I know it goes against my negative personality traits to focus on the positive, but it did go really well. I mean, hundreds of schools are using it as a teaching resource. Every week I hear from students who are doing history at university, having been inspired by it. It's been endorsed by, some of the world's leading historians like William Dalrymple, Peter Frankopan. But it kills me to say that, but I need to say it because otherwise the rage and the racism and the abuse hogs all the attention. Yes,
your attention as well. I could give you a masterclass in self-promotion if you want, Satnam. It's something that comes very naturally to me. But let's a quick word on that. You do excite extraordinary anger in the minds of people who are objecting in the style of Jacob Rees-Mogg and his new habit of shouting at stately homes. They actually hate the idea of history being more widely known. It is that simple, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I get it quite badly, and I've stopped doing events for adults. But other imperial historians have it worse. Davy Olusoga has a bodyguard. Professor Corinne Fowler, who I know you've talked to, had to call the police, is libelled in the newspapers, was scared to walk alone on the streets. And the fact is, as your book explains, there's a well-funded, government-endorsed campaign of intimidation of imperial historians by the right-wing press and pressure groups like Restore Trust. Yes. And there's nothing new about defending empire. Niall Ferguson did it, Jan Morris did it. But what's different now is that government ministers and MPs are getting involved. You've got these opaquely funded pressure groups like Restore Trust getting involved.
Where do you feel it comes from? What is the fear they have of history being more widely known? Is that too simplistic a question? They're worried about reparations in the case of Certainly, at least one of the people that you write about in the new book, that there is a very obvious link between his current fortune, he's a Conservative MP, and the fact that his family had plantations and still do have holdings in Barbados.
Yeah, Richard Drax, one of the richest MPs in Parliament.
So reparations would be one fear, although that's unlikely to be something that affects Billy Buncher numbers on Twitter with a bulldog avatar. What else are they frightened of?
I think it's mainly about race. And if you basically say that brown people are here for a reason, that they're exploited, that they are owed things like representation and perhaps even reparations, you've got to give up some of your power.
Yeah.
And why would people in charge want to do that?
And for people who've lived their whole life with privilege, equality feels like oppression, to coin a helpful, although hackneyed
That
phrase.
is it. That's the entire culture war of the last 5 years.
Which brings us to Empire World, which has an air of inevitability to it, given both the impact and the success of Empire Land. But I mean, without stating the bleeding obvious, the world is a lot bigger than Britain, but you tried to do a similar job. Was it harder to write?
Yeah, it was, but I thought it was so essential because I think you need to understand this history to understand so many daily things in life around the world. Tea, rum, the existence of countries like Nigeria and Pakistan, Sierra Leone, cities like Nairobi, all created by the British Empire. But also you need to understand this history to understand current affairs. Like Yemen, guess what? The East India Company was there. Palestine, guess what? We sort of created that situation. Myanmar, Kashmir. And I think we also need to understand this history because the world understands it. And it's embarrassing that we go around lecturing people about Palestine and Kashmir without reflecting on the fact that we created those situations, that we lecture the world on democracy and the environment and human rights, when we have distinctly sketchy records on those things during British Empire.
And that's one of the things you discover. You do quite a lot of travelling for this one, which marks it out from the last one.
And goes against my...
You're not natural. You're not a natural. You're not Alan Wicker.
I still regret leaving Wolverhampton, to be honest.
Full stop. Full stop. But you do quite a lot of travelling, and that's one of the things you discover, that there is oddly a much better understanding of the British Empire's impact on the wider world, in the wider world, than there is in the cradle of the British Empire.
Absolutely, because they live with the legacies. Whereas for us, empire is something that happened elsewhere. So for us, it can always be an academic argument. And it always has been. In this country, we talk about empire, about whether it was good or bad. That is not the way they talk about it in India, where there's a massive program of decolonization. It's not the way they talk about it in the Caribbean, where the conversation about reparations is real political issue.
And growing.
But we just see it as an academic, something to be discussed on the letters pages of the Times.
And there's just an out of sight and out of mind element to it as well, which is probably the biggest target that you aim at, isn't it? Is bringing it into sight, bringing these conversations front and centre. To what end? Just illumination, just to bring light into the darkness.
I think when we're trying to be a serious country, and we're trying to be grown up, hopefully, aren't we? Especially with Brexit, it's forced us to go out in the world and re-establish our relationships. So we go to places like Mauritius, and British people just have no understanding of the indentured labour that we introduced there, the 1 million Indians we sent around the world. We can't hope to have meaningful business trade relationships with these countries without understanding how we shaped them and made them.
That's a really important point, isn't it? When you have sort of almost sabre-rattling trade policies from people like Liz Truss and latterly Kemi Badenoch, who are both opponents of the sort of work that you do, particularly Badenoch, the kind of history that you do. The idea of doing a trade deal with one of the countries that you write about in the book without having a better understanding of that country's history and its relationship with British Empire is incredibly self-defeating. You could almost flip it, couldn't you? You could almost turn it into a handbook, a necessary handbook for politicians seeking to make the necessary post-Brexit trade deals with further flung outposts of the old empire.
Yeah, totally. And actually, even the way we do our charitable work is ridiculous. I mean, for example, we're really into animal charities in this country.
Yes, I think the Donkey Sanctuary gets more than any other.
Yeah, I think something like a quarter of British people donate to animal charities every year. And yet, some of those animal charities set up by imperialists, by hunters, who had caused those problems. They had hunted some of these animals to the point of extinction in the first place. So when the royal family stand up and say, we need to care about animal conservation, maybe they should reflect upon the fact that their relatives literally shot some of these tigers to the point of extinction.
Our forebears are responsible for the flirtation with extinction. Therefore, please put your money in this jar.
And no reflection on it. And then the palaces and the stately homes full of the ivory, the mahogany trees that we felled, so these forests were almost made extinct. Just no reflection on the responsibility we have for creating these problems in the first place.
For people already perhaps primed to bristle at these depictions, how do you address positives? How do you sort of acknowledge, if indeed there are any?
For me, it's not about, so I'm arguing in the book, opposite things can be true at the same time. This is a powerful idea that could rescue all of us in many spheres of life. And actually, British Empire, yes, it was responsible. It resulted in democracy around the world, but it also resulted in instability. It resulted in massive environmental destruction, but also it gave birth to modern environmentalism. It spread the free press, but also spread censorship. Opposite things can be true at the same time. But until now, it feels like books either argue that empire was all bad or all good, and as with so many things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Which is where you land.
Yeah,
although
I guess,
with a lean towards impact as opposed to benefit, I think.
it's a lean towards taking the emotion out of it and just trying to understand this stuff rather than talking about guilt or shame, which is the language that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg use.
Yes, all the time. And on a more personal level, because it's a personal book, isn't it? I mean, unlike some historians' work, you are in the pages. You don't maintain authorly detachment. You know, Wolverhampton resonates through parts of it. Your background, as you say, because it's what informs your curiosity. And of course, the reactions to it are in there. Some of the difficulties that you've had since Empire Land was published. You put it all out there. Why did you do that?
I think that's important because I personally don't read many history books because I find them detached and dry. Not all of them, some amazingly written. But I find that putting myself in it brings people along with me. And I think something I learnt when I wrote my memoir, which was...
Boy with the top knot.
Which was about schizophrenia, a book about the most difficult subject, I think, on the planet.
Yes.
No one wants to pick up a book about schizophrenia. But if you bring people along with you and make some jokes, maybe they will learn something. And hopefully I've done the same with Empire World.
Well, I think you have. And so do many other much more qualified people than me, including, as you say, the esteemed historians Peter Frankopan and William Dalrymple. Empire World by Satnam Sanghera is out, well, tomorrow technically, but it'll be in bookshops. So have you seen it yet in the windows?
I'm going to go hunting around. Have you done this for yourself?
It's a lovely moment, isn't it? It's a lovely. You see, the problem is because of timings, yours will be pushing mine out now. But I'm prepared to make that sacrifice, Satnam, for the greater good. I'll see you very soon, I hope. Congratulations on another absolute masterpiece. Empire World by Satnam Sanghera, as I say, is out now and comes highly recommended. It's 12:46. I'm sure, my apologies if I'm doing you a grave disservice, but I would be surprised if you are the first to come up with this line, but I haven't seen it before. A few Brits got drunk on empire and the world got the hangover. That's from Will, as a sort of full stop at the end of that conversation with Satnam Sanghera. I mentioned that my next guest has also rather benefited from the news agenda this week for his latest opus. I speak of Alan Rusbridger, now editor of Prospect magazine, formerly editor of The Guardian, and, well, what's the correct word? Investigator of perceived problems at the BBC, Alan. Tell us how it began. You did appear on the programme when your antennae started twitching in rather unlikely circumstances, when you stumbled across something that appeared to be true in Nadine Dorries' memoir.
There was a story left off the page that Robbie Gibb, who had been Theresa May's spin doctor, now a director at the BBC, had tried with this mysterious figure inside Number 10, Dougie Smith, to fix the appointment of the chair of Ofcom. And nobody denied that. Nobody would comment on it, but nobody would deny it. So I thought that must be true. And then I thought, well, why are they all protecting Robbie Gibb? And I spent the last month really making phone calls, and the result is this piece which really tells a story which is a bit murkier than I thought it was about his influence in the BBC.
And it runs to 6,000 words, which
I'm afraid it does.
Which is a testament to just how much you have unearthed, and it appears under the headline, How the Government Captured the BBC. We should begin, for the benefit of people who don't know, with a few words on exactly who Robbie Gibb is.
So he was Theresa May's spin doctor. So it's a bit like putting Alistair Campbell into to be on the BBC board a year after stepping down. He's a partisan figure. He makes no bones about it. He said, I'm not a wet pattern conservative. I'm a Thatcherite conservative. And he was appointed to the BBC. Again, many people may not know that the government appoints people to be on the BBC board, because we have this picture of the BBC as being completely independent of government. And once he got there, he's been pretty interventionist in what he would see as enforcing impartiality.
And is this the murk? Is this the bulk of the murk that you refer to? Is the extent of his influence?
Well, the murk is how he was appointed, because this man, Dougie Smith, you ring up Number 10, they deny any knowledge of him. They say, talk to Conservative Central Office, they deny any knowledge of him. So you've got this person who is literally unaccountable making key appointments like this. The murk
under successive Tory prime ministers is one of the interesting things about him, isn't he? He doesn't go with the regime.
He's
he seems
a lurker.
to stay put.
He's a lurker.
Yes.
Why did he want to fix the appointment of Ofcom? Because again, we think in this country Ofcom is independent, like the BBC. So something is going on, and then you think, well, Robbie Gibb was on a committee which actually Lucy Fraser just made more important. There are 4 people on it, 2 of whom work for the BBC, so they can't mark their own homework. So that just leaves Robbie Gibb and the former chairman of the Tate Gallery, Nick Sirota. So, sooner or later they're going to be dealing with Israel Gaza, because the BBC's coverage of that has been, questioned. Turns out Robbie Gibb is the 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, which has been highly critical of the BBC. So we're asking superhuman qualities of detachment and compartmentalization from this man who has gone into the BBC saying he's going to cure it of being woke.
And all the while having a huge stake in an organ that swims very quickly in the opposite direction.
Yes, and all these things, I think, were partly known by some people. So this piece really tries to pull it all together.
I did. I mean,
well, the other mystery, he's in Company's House. He's 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, but he obviously hasn't got that money, so he's owning it on behalf of someone else. So the lack of transparency around all this is really disturbing.
Well, you are a Fleet Street veteran. How do you account for the lack of transparency? Is it a lack of interest? Is it a lack of curiosity? Is it fear, cowardice? I've written about some of these links and some of these issues, but I didn't know some of the stuff that you have published, and yet I noticed some of the names in the web where Robbie Gibb sits in the centre of it. The web leads to people like Andrew Neil and William Shawcross, who I think his daughter is in Rishi Sunak's Downing Street. I know she donated money to his leadership campaign. Is that why? Is it actually just a very powerful network that people generally don't want to pick a fight with?
I think it's a powerful network, but the wheels within the wheels, the way that some of these appointments have happened, are deeply opaque. So the original impetus for the story was, why would Downing Street want to fix the chairmanship? You remember that the original plan was to put the editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, in,
who doesn't own a computer, was going to be in charge
who
of
hates the
internet
BBC,
legislation,
or hates the BBC's stance on things. So it is an attempt by the government to control the BBC. And we've seen in Poland what happens when a government tries to put their people in. It's kind of sort of the act of autocrats. And it's new in this country, and I think it needs to be held up to the light.
And how so? I mean, because the headline is fairly extreme, isn't it? When you talk about how the government has captured the BBC, most viewers of the BBC won't feel that they've seen evidence of that capture on their screens.
Well, the way it was put to me, you've got the Director General of the BBC, who is beholden to the government because he has to get the money out of them. It was, and Tim Davey can come on your programme and deny this, but it is said that he believes that Robbie Gibb is, as the government appointee, the person he has to stay in with and keep on board. Actually, he didn't get all the money that he was promised, so he hasn't been able to deliver on that. But you can see how this begging bowl arrangement, you've got to keep the government on side, and you've got the government spy in the cab.
And our colleagues here now at Global, of course, Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall, have had some experience of this. Lewis, in particular, reflecting upon the absurdity of taking lectures on impartiality from a man who was in Downing Street 10 minutes ago.
Well, that's the ridiculous thing, and nobody I spoke to on the BBC could remember a board member who had been that interventionist at story level. So getting in touch with people at the weekends and saying, why is this story running and that story is running?
So trying to exercise control over
Absolutely.
the BBC's news output and news agenda.
I think he's the most important journalist at the BBC, even though he doesn't work there. And that makes him one of the most important journalists in the country.
Of course it does. Does it change when the government changes?
Well, you see, I think if the Labour government did get in and started behaving, can I say they put Alistair Campbell, I'm being ridiculous, as a board member, or Seamus Milne, the howls of outrage you would have from the other side.
I don't think it's being ridiculous at all. It's an obvious parallel.
Yes,
it's exactly
but you can imagine the howls of outrage that would happen. They
Yes.
would say that's completely awful, and yet nobody's raised an eyebrow. So I think the point of bringing all this out into the open is that something bad has happened, and you can't be selective. You can't complain if one side does it and then the other side does it.
He's also described by the Telegraph as a lifelong Brexiteer, and we know that even in his old job he was trying to exercise influence on what the BBC did and didn't report post-referendum on, as should we say, some of the truth began to emerge regarding some of the claims that had been made by precisely the sort of people that he continues to knock about with. Speaking of esteemed colleagues, very briefly, it was Ian Dale, wasn't it, who got the Dougie Smith name out of Nadine Dorries after she had insisted for at least 4 seconds that she would never in a million years be persuaded to divulge his identity.
It may have been 3 seconds.
How the government captured the BBC appears, it's a really important read, and I don't think Alan will mind if I say that if you enjoyed my book, How They Broke Britain, then you will certainly enjoy it. If enjoy is not quite the right word, is it?
It's sad. It's not enjoyable. But it is important.
You have
to sit down and read it.
You really should. And that is in the latest issue of Prospect. That's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app where you can pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store. Speaking of podcasts, I'm on the Table Manners podcast with Jesse and Lenny Ware this week, which has caused enormous excitement among my younger colleagues. So I thought I'd better let you know. Do go to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.